David DeAngelis presents The Greatest Power in the Universe. Discover the amazing power in your mind and how to use it by Uell Andersen. Digitally narrated using the voice of Edward Herman. What this book will do for you. 1. It will show you how to use the greatest power in the universe to develop your abilities and attain your desires. 2. It will teach you how to use the strongest structure in the universe to build better memory and accelerated mind power. 3. It will show you how to use inner ecology to improve your health, increase your longevity, and restore your body to youthfulness. 4. It will teach you how to use the feedback signals of outer psychology to remove emotional charge from your memory bank and free your energies for success and achievement. 5. It will show you how to use the ecology diet to build up your vitality and increase your energy and free yourself from disease and malfunction. 6. It will teach you a simple new way to quit smoking, stop drinking, and rid yourself of excess weight. 7. It will show you how to open the door to your subconscious mind and use its forces to win love and happiness. 8. It will teach you how to establish contact with your mastermind and use its powers to expand your consciousness and experience astral travel. 9. It will show you how to meet and know your master self, the spiritual guide who controls your destiny. 10. It will give you techniques for recalling your past lives and teach you how to become free of your karma. 11. It will show you how to see into the future, perceive things at a distance, read the thoughts of others. 12. It will reveal to you your spiritual destiny, show you how to claim that destiny now, place in your hands the keys to immortality and power. Prologue: Atlantis Rising. The American dream is the ancient dream of the prophets of Atlantis, who sought union with God, and thereby a measure of God's freedom and power. Today, all that man remembers of Atlantis is the gods who came out of the sea, the glory of their golden ornaments, the transcendency of their wisdom, and the sanctity of their symbols. Wherever the Atlanteans roamed, they erected temples and pyramids, patterned after the great sanctuary in their city of the Golden Gates, and so it was that they built the pyramids of Egypt, Mexico, and Central America. In the midst of this program of colonization, the cataclysms began that sank Atlantis beneath the sea. The spiritually illumined withdrew from the doomed continent, carrying with them their sacred scrolls. Nearly all the cosmological myths that underlie the world's great religions are based on the Atlantean sacred scrolls, for they comprise the great way to spiritual illumination. There are many paths, but there is only one great way. Now the cast of characters has assembled once again. Now the costumes and settings have been taken from memory storage and refurbished anew. Now the orchestra strikes the first resounding chord of the overture. The curtain is about to go up. Atlantis is rising. Chapter 1. Discoveries of Cybernetics. Within a small and heavily wooded ravine in the Cascade Mountains on the Oregon coast nestles a tiny, jewel-like lake where human foot has seldom trod. In crystal depths swim giant trout, landlocked all the year except for spring, when overflowing waters carry them by creek down to the sea. Anglers greet this sudden bounty by renewing faith in the mysterious lake that not a single one has seen, though more than one has often searched. I, too, looked for the lake but never found it. I even wrote a story about a man and his son who looked. They didn't find it either. I realized then that the lake symbolized the secret of life. I discovered that secret through cybernetics. The real and the unreal. The word was coined in 1948 by Norbert Wiener, a mathematics professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, when he published under that name a book describing the functioning of the automatic feedback control devices that were being used in steering ships and flying planes and in the new computing machines. He derived the word from the Greek, meaning steersman, and much of the book was devoted to drawing analogies between the feedback control devices of machines and the feedback control devices of the human nervous system. The brain, illustrated Wiener, might best be likened to a complex computing machine. Since his book was published by MIT, it was distributed to a restricted audience. But computer developments over the next decade made Weiner's utterances so prophetic that John Wiley published a 1961 edition for the general public. A copy fell into my hands. It is difficult to describe my excitement. After having traveled fully around the world in my search for the essence of man's mind, now for the first time, I felt I had found something concrete and material, something demonstrable and repeatable, something I surely could learn to understand and control. Earlier, I had published several books which developed the premise of an indwelling God, but mine was an intellectual vision only, and the full realization had eluded me. Hard on the heels of the Wiley edition came a popularization of Weiner's work by the eminent plastic surgeon, Maxwell Maltz. His book, Psychocybernetics, combined feedback control with positive thinking to provide a regime for self-improvement, and it became a bestseller. Overnight, thousands of Americans were introduced to the idea that the brain was a highly sophisticated machine. A few, like myself, were thus led to ask, who's operating it? The ghost in the skull. Dean Wooldridge thought that nobody was. The wealthy co-founder of Rama Wooldridge resigned his company position in 1962 to devote himself to scientific pursuits and to writing, and in 1963 he published The Machinery of the Brain, a scholarly compendium of correspondences between brain and computer functioning, an area which he felt offered unparalleled opportunity for scientific advancement. Several other books carried the same theme. Among them were J. von Neumann's The Computer and the Brain, D. O'Hebb's The Organization of Behavior and Brain Mechanisms and Learning, a compendium of papers edited by Fessard, Girard, Konorsky, and de Laforesnay. Though I refused to concede the argument of the materialists and give up the idea of a ghost in the skull, nevertheless I had to admit that most behavior seemed automatic. The human machine had enormous potential, but it had to be trained to develop it. Training was conditioning, a term used by Ivan Pavlov to describe the process by which he produced automatic reaction in dogs. On a sultry afternoon in mid-August, I received a long-distance phone call from a vice president of a national firm, requesting that I run a series of training programs for his sales force. I had received such invitations before and had always declined, since my primary concern was man's spiritual quest rather than his financial aspirations, and I simply felt that my brand of philosophy was not particularly suited to the rough-and-tumble world of competitive capitalism. But this time my caller was insistent. He had read 3 of my books, he said, and he knew that I was the man to do the job. He was positive that what his sales force needed was a spiritual anchor. The upshot was that I agreed to take on the task. A session with God. The first session was held in a resort hotel in upstate Illinois. 100 salesmen were in attendance, together with their wives, and they had won this privilege with their sales records, so they were affluent and gregarious and hard-nosed, and fond of alcoholic beverages. The first time I mentioned the word God, I could feel my audience stir, and after a bit a tall man with a large Adam's apple and wearing spectacles raised his hand, and I called on him. He stood, removed his spectacles, polished them carefully with a handkerchief, placed them back on his nose, stared around at the audience, then fixed me with his gaze. "God," he said, "spells dog backwards." He sat down amid strained laughter. I glanced at the vice president who was on the stage with me. Beads of perspiration were popping on his forehead, but he managed a sickly grin. Well, I hadn't survived 4.5 decades by persisting in unrewarding efforts. If my audience didn't want God, I'd give them cybernetics. "Apparently we have a champion speller in the audience," I said. "Since he has demonstrated his proficiency with 3-letter words, perhaps he would like to try something longer. Would the gentleman please stand up?" Tall and bespectacled, he arose from his seat, a confident smile on his face. "Try cybernetics," I said. He stared. "What?" "Cybernetics." It's a new science of improving human performance by feedback control. Never heard of it. Take a crack at it anyway. Cybernetics. Cybernetics, he spelled hesitantly. I spelled it correctly on the blackboard, then said, "So you see, we've both learned something. I learned how to spell dog backwards, and you learned that things are not always what they seem. Now we both can get down to learning something about improving our performance through feedback control. That way we'll make more money." The subsequent 3 days were a roaring success. The ingredients of genius. I had to wing it, of course, make up much of it on the spot, but my head was crammed so full of the stuff that it just seemed to be there when I needed it, and fortunately somebody had a tape recorder turned on, so I emerged from the session with a complete new course for improving human performance. I called it Success Cybernetics. I like to think that it was not simply a parroting of things I'd read, but rather a genuine creative effort, that all I'd learned about cybernetics was filtered through my experience in athletics, businesses, and writing, my years of study in philosophy and comparative religions, to produce something different from anything that had been done to that time. For fundamental to my understanding of cybernetics was awareness of the power of a well-drawn plan to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This kind of control of the future was something that seers and soothsayers had been after for years without notable success, and I found myself excited about being on the verge of a breakthrough in mental power. The automatic feedback control devices in the human nervous system were easy enough for most people to grasp. They could understand that you could never become a good automobile driver, a good typist, a good piano player, until you were able to perform all the necessary movements automatically, without thinking, responding to signals in much the same way as an electronic computer responds to signals. Nearly everyone had had the experience of driving 5 or 10 miles to the office through heavily congested traffic, making all the appropriate moves, with his mind on something else, so that when he arrived at the office, he couldn't remember a single event that had transpired en route. Thus, nearly everyone understood that the nervous system usually performed automatically. The obvious corollary of this understanding was the principle that to achieve skills you must practice, and practice, and practice, until the skills were ingrained in the nervous system and functioned automatically. To most people, this realization came as a shock. They had thought that Heifetz just walked out there and played the violin, that Bob Hope was born with that timing, that Einstein popped out of the womb, clutching the theory of relativity. For a person by dint of sweat and diligence to be able to train himself to genius seemed heresy. Heredity and environment. Was environment more important than heredity then? Or was heredity more important than environment? I couldn't help thinking that the question was much like the one that had plagued me from the start. Was materialism more important than spirituality? For example, among people who practiced the same amount, some would perform better than others. And among the people who practiced the least would be someone who could perform better than somebody who practiced the most. So there was a mystical factor. But was heredity so mystical? Hadn't we isolated the genetic structure? Didn't it carry a coded signal to other cells to tell them what kinds of cells to be, just like the master program of an electronic computer? Oh, that coded signal could tell those cells what to be, all right, but could it tell them what to do? It could not tell them what to do. It could only tell them what to be. They would have to learn what to do. So in the seminars, we concentrated on goals, all the things we wanted to get done or see done sometime in the future, whether it was 2 hours from now or 20 years from now. You can't imagine the consternation this produced. People sat for hours with lead pencils to their tongues. It turned out that the cause of this paralysis was their feeling that they were being required to predict the future rather than make it up. That anyone could possibly make it up was foreign to their thinking. When it was pointed out that a writer made up a story, and an artist made up a painting, and a composer made up a song, they thought that the comparison was unfair, because they were being asked to make up something that was real. The future isn't real yet, I objected. It has to be made up. But that isn't always true, they complained. The future isn't always what we think it is going to be. It's usually a surprise. The only people who are surprised by the future are the people who don't make it up. Goal achievement. That got us into goal achievement. We were able to understand that the only way a person could learn a skill was to get a mental picture of himself performing that skill. That was a goal. The goal gave him a means of disciplining his actions. After he had practiced enough to learn the skill, he didn't need the mental picture anymore because the appropriate reactions had been trained into his nervous system. That was cybernetics. Goals and automatic reactions. What you wanted to accomplish and the steps that would accomplish it. Practicing the steps, getting good at them, doing them, reaching the goal. A nice little system for getting things done. It used both the mind and body, but there seemed no place for the soul. I missed the soul, but apparently nobody else did. The program won immediate acceptance. Soon people were acting as if they had mastered all the secrets. It's really so simple, they exclaimed. That worried me. But as time passed and more people embraced the program enthusiastically, I gradually put my fears aside. After all, the proof of a thing was in its performance, and everybody who took to getting things done the cybernetics way was getting things done better and faster. Demands on my time, however, began to accelerate, so it eventually occurred to me to put the course in book form. Thus, it could be taught by sales managers and personnel directors, and athletic coaches, and military officers and business executives and school teachers, and whoever else had a stake in improving human performance. About this time, a disconcerting thing happened. One of my prized pupils, a superachiever, was stricken with a heart attack. A relatively young man of 42, he was forced into a life of semi-retirement, being told by his doctor that he had strained his resources beyond the breaking point and would need much time and rest to repair the damage. To the credit of my stricken friend, he never once suggested that his cybernetics program might have brought on his heart attack. But I couldn't help toying with the possibility myself, and I didn't much like what I saw. Mr. Midas. After some prompting, his wife revealed how he had set a goal to be president of his company, and how he had worked day and night to achieve it. She confirmed that the resultant 7-day-a-week, 16-hour-a-day schedule had been too much for him. So, for the time being at least, his goal had been defeated. I thought over this problem for a long time, but could see no solution. Eventually, I shrugged it off as just one of those things, the exception perhaps that proved the rule, and turned again to happier areas where things were working fine. Then another unusual thing happened. A young man who had set a goal of making a great deal of money had made over $2 million during a hectic 9-week period on the commodity market. Everybody who visited him brought back a strange report. He appeared downcast, not at all elated. Some even reported him despondent. That observation was apparently close to the point, for within a few weeks he attempted suicide, and his death was narrowly averted. His friends prevailed upon me to call on him, which I did with misgivings. One does not easily face up to the fact that his antagonist is death. I found him tucked into a lounge chair on the balcony outside his apartment. Though it was a pleasant day, he was bundled up in blankets, and his face was pale and drawn. The autumn sun cast shadows on the street below, and in the distance, the shimmering haze of the ocean could be seen. He apologized for not rising to receive me, and explained that he had been overcome by such lethargy, that the simplest movements were beyond him. I tried to bring the conversation around to the money he had made, but he seemed not to hear me, staring into the distance in a manner which made me uncomfortable. Finally, I tried talking about all the things he could do with the money, all the places he could go, the things he could see, but this made no impression either. At last I arrived at my wit's end, and we sat on the balcony in silence. When I rose to go, his liquid eyes stared at me. "Call me Mr. Midas," he said. A strange meeting. The interview had depressed me, and I felt like being alone, so I let the car have its head, and before long discovered that I was driving south from Santa Monica along the Southern California coast. Eventually, I reached a deserted beach where a jetty jutted into the sea. On impulse, I decided to park and walk out on the pier, there to look upon the ocean and feel the breeze and reflect upon my afternoon visit. The night had settled down chill, and by the time I found a parking place, I was thankful that I had a sweater in the car. Donning it, I hiked across the sands and made my way out on the pier. Along the horizon hung a faint reddish glow from the starboard running lights of a ship. The sky was overcast. Not a star was to be seen. Breaking seas ran beneath the jetty with an exaggerated whoosh and roar. I wandered out onto the pier, staring unseeingly at the sea and night. Thus it was that I suddenly came upon a man sitting on a small bench toward the seaward end of the jetty. His presence startled me. Doubly so his appearance.
The hardest thing is obviously finding products to sell and then getting authorized to sell those products. So with Ecom Authority, they've been able to do that.
We're going to set you up on Walmart. We're going to pick out.
He wore a violet jacket of old-fashioned cut, a white ruffled shirt, dark striped trousers, square-toed boots, and he rested his hands on a gold-crested walking stick. His hair was long, dark and abundant, and he wore a full mustache and neatly trimmed beard. Clear blue eyes were fixed on me quizzically, and he looked so elegant sitting there that I wondered if I was suffering an hallucination. "You look like an educated man," he said. "Do you know Faust?" The question took me aback, but I managed to admit that I was familiar with Goethe's work. He nodded his head, as if in affirmation. "One must pay, of course. That is what makes a bargain." I suppose that at any other time the obliqueness of the conversation would have irritated me, and I would have demanded to know at once what was meant, but there was something so sophisticated about his appearance that I found myself weighing the various meanings that might be intended. My mind was drawn at once to the situation of Mr. Midas. The fantastic bargain. Can one truly have anything in the world if he gives up his immortal soul? I asked. That is apparently what Goethe was trying to say, answered my companion. Why would Goethe occupy himself with such a question? The walking stick was raised, then thumped against the planking of the pier. Its owner gave vent to a melodious laugh and said in high good humor, "Tell me, truly now, is there anything else for man to be concerned with? Assuming he has a soul, I suppose not. Do you assume that he has no soul? It is a question to which I have been addressing myself most seriously. For a long time, I felt that man had a soul, and I made every effort to discover it. But at last it seemed mere vanity, so I turned away from the abstract to the concrete, which has proven a great deal more useful to both myself and others." "Then you've made the Faustian bargain." "How do you mean?" "You've given up the abstract for the concrete, which simply means that you've given up your soul in order to have things." I stared at him. I should not like to think that the bargain was irreversible. His gaze seemed to discern my innermost thoughts. "The fact that you are here is proof that the bargain is not yet irreversible." He banged his stick against the pier in emphasis. "Not yet, at least." Then he stood and threw a cloak about him. "Well, I must be going. It has been an interesting chat." He started off along the pier and immediately disappeared from view. A light fog had risen, and I was left in the isolation of my thoughts. A strange sensation of vertigo seized me, as if there was no place solid to stand. I felt that I was immersed in a dream, trying desperately to awaken. Staggering along the pier toward the shoreline, it seemed that I must walk this narrow way forever. Finally, I reached the sand, then found the car, and managed to drive home. When I went to bed, my dreams were haunted by an elegant figure in a violet jacket, and I knew that some great change was about to enter my life. Treading the Faustian line. In the morning, I arrived at a decision. I would postpone my teaching. An invisible weight disappeared from my shoulders, and I sang boisterously in the shower. I hadn't felt so good for months. Now I understood that I had only half the truth, and until I had much more, I had best confine myself to being a student rather than a teacher. The question was, how best to start? Should I circle again the perimeter of man's philosophical and religious thought, hoping to discern something that had escaped me the first time? Or should I pick up my search among the axioms and formulas of science, an area that at least had produced cybernetics? I was persuaded at once, because of the little I knew of science, that whatever was missing from my complete understanding existed in the area where I understood the least. I resolved to carry on my subsequent investigations in the area of science. In high school and college, I had a terrible time with mathematics. It seemed to me that numbers were a waste of time because there were no ideas in them. 5 years later, I woke to the fact that not only were there ideas in them, but those ideas were permanent. In other words, they were laws. The way I came to see this was I became navigating officer of my ship during World War II. They gave me some tables so I could correlate my star sight, height above the horizon, compass direction and time, with my ship's position on the face of the ocean. I got to wondering how all this was done, and that launched me into spherical trigonometry. When I started drawing in my mind those great triangles of balancing pressures that extend throughout the universe, when I actually started seeing that those triangles existed evermore, when I began realizing that the relationship between them was immutable and unchanging, for the first time, I felt I had touched the eternal heart of God. Now I was treading the Faustian line. Because, to really get into something, one had to get into it exclusively. To get into science exclusively, I had to exclude mysticism. That meant I had to become one-sided. That meant I must adopt a hard-headed, materialistic, show-me-I'm-from-a-shuri type of practical realism about everything that crossed my path. Oh, I could play the role. What, after all, is an actor but his quest? And I knew I could save myself from being permanently cast in the role. What, after all, is strong enough to stand against growth? And the objective was intriguing indeed. What is the meaning of man's life? Or was there a meaning? And if so, where was that meaning to be found? The mind controls everything. When one takes on an area of knowledge as broad as science itself, and an arena as large as the universe, he is likely to find himself in the position of not knowing where to start. In such cases, the winds carry their own boating and leaning ladders and black cats, and most of all, well-meaning friends. Thus, it was on a Saturday night, in the midst of a party that was high if not drunken. A friendly fellow who had known me in college told me that he was now a professor at Uell. Though I didn't remember him, I acknowledged the past, then politely inquired what he taught. Brain sciences, he answered, and for the rest of the evening, he educated me. It turned out that the University of California at Los Angeles had a brain research laboratory that was doing extraordinary work in lifting the mystery that surrounded the working of the human brain. S80 had come up with some remarkable findings that indicated how little was known and understood about how the brain really functioned. I acknowledged that I had heard of Dr. 80. Brainwaves, cried the professor. That's the thing of the future. 80 is discovering all sorts of things. For example, right now I know you're in beta. You'd feel better if you were in alpha. You'd get better ideas if you were in theta. Well, whatever. Somewhere along the way, we're going to discover that the mind controls everything. Are you an MD? I asked. Everything is chemical, he replied. Where do I find out about these brainwaves? Try the biomedical library at UCL. Chapter 2. Brainwaves Made Simple. The University of California at Los Angeles lies just across Sunset Boulevard from luxurious Bel Air and is wedged in between posh Beverly Hills and wealthy Brentwood, giving it perhaps the most strategic financial position of any university in the world. Nor is the campus itself disappointing. Constructed upon a spacious tract of rolling hills like ancient Jerusalem, the university buildings are large and imposing and reflect pleasing groupings of color against the rich green of a well-watered landscape. One can easily believe in such surroundings that all is well with the world simply because everything about it has been put into books. The UCLA Medical Center overlooks the athletic fields and its parking lot is as jammed as any in downtown Los Angeles. The huge multi-floored structure houses research laboratories, operating rooms, convalescent rooms, testing laboratories, outpatient clinics, emergency facilities, libraries, lecture halls, stores, cafeterias, and recreation rooms. Along wide and silent corridors glide rubber-soled nurses, as well as MD. interns and orderlies, starched and clean in blue and white, while the antiseptic odor of Hippocrates' profession wafts along hallways and embeds itself in clothing, furniture, and food alike. I was given a map which revealed that the biomedical library was in the northeast corner of the building, and as I walked what seemed a mile along the corridors, I couldn't help sensing that the center had the self-sustaining quality of an independent organism. Should all communication with the outside world suddenly cease, it seemed clear that within these isolated halls, business would be carried on as usual. Self-regulating people. My doctor friend had given me a card of introduction to the librarian, but as it
Listen to this.
turned out, it wasn't necessary. I was informed that I could use all facilities, but I would not be allowed to take books off the premises. I was shown the reference catalog for both books and periodicals. Then I was left on my own. I found several books that looked interesting, and bearing them to a desk, made myself comfortable and began to read. Almost at once I became deeply engrossed in the material, being taken by a quote of Lord Adrian, the well-known biologist. New ideas in science are induced by new discoveries, and at the present time, the most potent factor in promoting new discoveries is the introduction of some new technique, some new tool that can be used for exploring natural phenomena. The book went on to say that sophisticated computer techniques applied to psychophysical research were almost certain to shed additional light on attention, consciousness, thought, and emotion. Perhaps it might even be possible to produce a society of self-regulating individuals who would no longer have to be governed by threats and penal systems, but who would take charge of regulating their own inner and outer lives so as to harmonize with society. Such persons, of course, would make it easier for others to lead stable and creative lives. For over 2 centuries, British medical doctors on foreign service in India had been sending back reports of such self-regulating people. They claimed that these persons, called yogis, could control many usually involuntary physiological processes, such as heart rate or pain. This control was laid to long practice of mental, emotional, and physical disciplines. Autogenic training. In this connection, there was some material on Johannes Schultz of Germany, who developed a Western system of self-regulation around 1910. It appeared to combine hypnotic techniques with methods of yoga. Freud had given up the use of hypnotism in therapy because its results were unpredictable, but Schultz felt that this defect was caused by the patient not being in control of the situation and resisting instructions. He therefore used auto-hypnosis in combination with yoga and called his system autogenic training, meaning self-generated training. The system had a measure of success in Europe, but never caught on in America. The principle involved was this: every change in the physiological state must be accompanied by an appropriate change in the mental-emotional state, and every change in the mental-emotional state must be accompanied by an appropriate change in the physiological state. This principle of balance made possible psychosomatic self-regulation. The key to understanding it seemed likely to be brainwaves, the tiny voltages emitted by the human brain as it went about its tasks of processing data, responding to signals, and otherwise governing the internal and external life of the individual. Here reference was made to studies of the brainwaves of yogis and Zen masters, but despite my eagerness to pursue matters further, the concrete confines in which I sat were proving too much for me, so I resolved to get a little fresh air and something to eat. The cafeteria was crowded, and there was a long line, so I took myself to the drugstore, where I found several small packages of breaded onion rings. These I carried onto the patio and sat in the sunshine, eating and smoking cigarettes and indulging myself in reveries. Thus occupied, I failed to hear my name called until somebody clapped me on the shoulder. I looked up into the face of an acquaintance whom I hadn't seen in years. "I thought it was you?" he exclaimed. There you sat, fat as a pig and smoking cigarettes like a chimney, and I couldn't believe my eyes. Somehow, I never thought you were the type to get fat and become a chain smoker. Monitoring meditation. The greeting scarcely endeared him to me. I remembered him from an advertising agency whose services I once had used, and it seemed to me he was as outspoken then as now. I mumbled that I had put on a few pounds and was having difficulty kicking the cigarette habit. He was disgustingly lean. "Man," he said, "don't you read the medical journals? Cigarettes will kill you. So will fat. Quit smoking and reduce, friend, or your time amongst us is limited." Nothing to do but invite him to sit down, and he spent the next half hour on this theme. I left uneaten at least half my onion rings and never smoked another cigarette in his presence. By the time a half hour had passed, I was squirming in my seat. I finally excused myself and made my way back to the book stacks, sucking in my stomach and feeling the conspicuous bulge of the package of cigarettes in my pocket. I resolved to get a doctor's appointment and find out what kind of shape I was in. Back in the book stacks, I began a study on the brainwaves of Zen masters. It developed that Zazen, which is Japanese for sitting in meditation, attracted the interest of physiologists and psychologists as early as 1950, but only recently had scientists at Kanazawa University in Tokyo began investigating it with the electroencephalograph, the famed EEG that measured brainwave amplitude and frequency. 48 Zen priests and nuns had been tested, together with 100 ordinary people who served as a control group. With electrodes pasted to their heads, the subjects adopted the stiff-backed, cross-legged position of meditation. Their respiratory rate dropped off to 4 or 5 breaths per minute, as against the normal 17 or 18, and their pulses fell 10 or 15 beats a minute below their normal rate. Body temperature dropped a few degrees in some cases. These effects were explained as being due mainly to the sitting position itself, which placed a strain on the diaphragm and affected the autonomic nervous system, causing a calming influence and a slowing down of body functions. Zen and Alpha. The brainwave record of the Zen masters revealed that they were neither in a hypnotic trance nor asleep while they were meditating. When one of the laymen heard an electric bell, the pattern of his brain waves was interrupted for about 15 seconds, but when the sound was repeated, he became used to it and eventually stopped reacting. The priests also reacted to the bell, but only for 2 or 3 seconds, and they continued to respond in this manner each time the bell was rung. Most surprising was the fact that the Zen masters produced great trains of alpha waves, while the meditating layman produced little or no alpha at all. It appeared that something unusual transpired within the brains of those who had trained themselves in meditation. The question was, did the increased alpha waves cause unusual abilities, or were they the result of unusual abilities? It certainly seemed, in the light of the balancing action between psyche and soma, that either could be the case. Here there was mention of the work of Gardner Murphy and Kenneth Garter in the area of biofeedback research, which was an attempt to train patients into voluntary control of their involuntary functioning by having them hooked up to instrumentation which signaled the electrical activity caused by inner states. I resolved to look into this farther, but the sun was lowering in the sky now, and I felt I had had enough for one day. Just before leaving the medical building, I stopped at a phone booth and called my doctor. He was going out of town for 2 weeks, and I would have to postpone seeing him until his return. In a way, it was a reprieve. We set the appointment for 3 weeks in the future. That night, the violet-jacketed man with the gold-headed walking stick appeared in my dream. "Syzygy to serendipity," he said. "The putting together of opposites leads to the fortunate finding of things not looked for." I awoke in the morning with a feeling of excitement. There was something strangely reminiscent about that dream, a feeling of déjà vu, that it had all happened before. Then I recalled another dream that had come to me earlier. There had been a terrible pain in my heart, and I had felt I was surely going to die, when suddenly my chest burst open, and lying in the gaping wound was a gigantic, iridescent pearl. "When one discovers a pearl of great price," said a voice, "he gives all that he has to obtain it." Now it seemed to me that the voice had been that of the man in the violet jacket. Brainwave frequencies. The next 3 weeks passed rapidly. I scarcely had time to attend to earning a living, so great was my absorption in research. I learned that there was a brain information center on the top floor of the book stacks of the biomedical library, and those in charge were kind enough to run a computer search delineating all source material on brainwaves. Since several hundred references were involved, I no sooner finished one text before I was into another. There was a certain drama to them, read like this, like pieces of an enormous jigsaw puzzle, and as I began to find various pieces that fit and to see an emerging pattern, I felt I was witness to some gigantic stage play, the third act of which promised a cosmic climax. My studies revealed that 4 principal brainwave patterns were known, and they were named alpha, beta, delta, and theta. Each was classified according to the number of cycles it made each second, and these cycles were called hertz. The delta wave varied between 1-3 cycles per second, the theta between 4-7 cycles per second, the alpha between 8-13, and the beta between 14-26. Researchers were unanimous in concluding that the beta and alpha waves were associated with conscious processes, while the theta and delta waves were associated with unconscious processes. Conscious and unconscious nervous processes might best be visualized as being divided by a continuously undulating boundary, as attention shifts from one region to the other. For example, the peripheral nervous system is divided into the autonomic and the craniospinal systems. The former is regarded as the involuntary nervous system, the latter as the voluntary nervous system. That each works in conjunction with the other is illustrated by the fact that when one learns to drive a car, many of the activities that were at first conscious, and to which attention must be given, gradually become unconscious, so that eventually it is possible when the mind is preoccupied to drive through miles of traffic without conscious awareness of other cars or traffic signals. Secrets of the alpha rhythm. The significant difference in controlling these two systems is a subtlety not often recognized. For control of the voluntary nervous system requires the use of active volition, while control of the involuntary nervous system requires the use of passive volition, that type of volition exhibited by Zen masters and yogis. Here lay a clue to developing mind and body control through brainwaves. The literature described a number of subjects who had been trained to produce a high percentage of alpha brainwaves through feedback, and these had reported sensations of great pleasantness, a kind of electronic high, a serenity, an alertness, a feeling of competence and well-being. Since this sounded like the meditation experience of yogis and Zen masters, it certainly seemed as if training oneself to produce a high percentage of alpha waves might be a shortcut to happiness. The alpha rhythm appeared to hold a secret. This brain rhythm appeared when the subject was in a relaxed state and disappeared when he became tense, at which time the beta rhythm took over. Also, the alpha rhythm usually only appeared when the subject's eyes were closed and disappeared when his eyes were opened. It also disappeared when he fell asleep, giving way to the slower theta and delta rhythms. The Menninger Foundation had produced evidence indicating that some subjects were natural alpha producers, while others produced little or no alpha. Natural alpha producers, through biofeedback devices, could be taught to produce a great amount of alpha, to slow their alpha frequencies, to increase the amplitude of their alpha waves, and even to produce alpha with their eyes open, just as Zen masters. Non-alpha producers, on the other hand, had difficulty learning to produce alpha, and their percentage of increase was far less than the natural alpha producers. In a delayed recall test, subjects who produced the highest percentage of alpha rhythm in their EEG patterns remembered the most material. High alpha production thus significantly correlated with the ability to learn faster and remember more. Moreover, there was considerable evidence linking brainwave production with creativity. Here the theta frequency was correlated with reverie and hypnagogic imagery. Hypnagogic imagery might best be described as pictures or words, which are not consciously generated or manipulated, but which spring into the mind full-blown. Such imagery is the warp and woof of new invention, new art forms, new enterprises. Feedback control of alpha waves. In a report by Kosamatsu and Hry on their EEG experiment with Zen masters, It was found that the moment the subject began to turn inward, continuous trains of alpha rhythm began to appear on his EEG record, that the frequency of the alpha pattern began to decrease toward the alpha-theta border, and that the subject in a state of reverie, satori, produced long trains of theta waves. Anand and Singh, in their EEG study of yoga masters, found the alpha-theta border intimately associated with the inward-turned attention of samadhi. They also reported that the inward-turned attention of their yogi subjects was so intense that neither flashing lights, sounding gongs, or intense heat could disrupt their concentration and cause alpha blocking. Creative people often have described the states of reverie, dream, or near dream, in which creative solutions have come to consciousness. Robert Louis Stevenson commanded his brownies to furnish him plots. Poincaré described mathematical ideas rising in clouds, dancing, colliding, and combining into the first fusion functions. Nearly all of us have had the experience of worrying for days over the solution to a problem, then suddenly receiving it, whole and complete, while we were shaving or driving to the office. That there was a relationship between such inspirations and the production of low-frequency alpha waves seemed inescapable. In addition, insofar as an individual could extend the voluntary control of his nervous system, he would also be enabled to liberate himself from conditioned responses. Voluntary control would move him in the direction of increased inner freedom, while conditioned control could only produce a loss of inner freedom. In this last insight, I found the reason for my feeling that the theory of cybernetics was incomplete. For conditioned responses, regardless of how effective and efficient they might be, were far too robot-like to satisfy my intuition of a divine nature in man. Feedback control devices used in brainwave training were varied and interesting. Because EEG signals are of low amplitude, 10 to 100 microvolts, it usually required highly sensitive amplifiers encased in laboratory-type machines to detect brainwaves. However, recent electronic developments had made it possible to produce low-cost portable alpha detectors, which a subject could use at home. Such alpha meters could be modified to show the presence of both alpha and theta waves, either by the production of sounds of certain frequency and amplitude, or by the presence of a flashing light. The latter device was not desirable, however, because of the necessity of keeping the eyes closed for optimum alpha production. Some experimenters had attached a small flashing light to the rim of spectacles, which were placed on the subject, enabling him to see the light flashes through closed eyelids. In any case, once feedback techniques for producing the specific physiological state had been mastered, mechanical devices could be dispensed with. 8 to 16 training hours attached to an alpha meter was generally regarded as sufficient. The doctor is far out. Involved as I was in soaking up data on brain rhythms, I nevertheless found it possible during the 3-week period before my doctor's appointment to quit smoking 4 times and to go on to diets. The remarks of my well-meaning friend had wounded me deeper than I thought, and I spent a good deal of time in front of the mirror observing my sagging waistline. Also, I began to count the number of cigarettes I smoked. That number was now between 50 and 60 a day. With only the slightest mental calculation, I could easily see that I spent very little time without something in my mouth. Since I could neither stay on a diet nor quit smoking, I began to feel that there was something terribly wrong with me, that I was burdened with some Freudian oral fixation springing out of guilt or fears buried in my subconscious. Finally, to save what little self-respect I had left, I decided to forget about diets and not smoking. After all, the doctor might easily find that I was in tip-top shape, and that the extra weight I was packing around was actually beneficial to a man of my particular bone structure. Meanwhile, I had become familiar with the work of Barbara Brown, Joe Camilla, and Thomas Mulholland. Dr. Camilla operated from a little laboratory near the University of California at Berkeley, and his work was being done under the auspices of the Langley Porter Neuropsychiatric Institute. Reportedly, the sign on his door, rather than saying, "The doctor is in," said instead, "The doctor is far out." Word had gotten around the Bay Area that being hooked up to Joe Camilla's electronic gadgets produced a high equivalent to grass or acid, and it didn't cost a cent. In fact, Dr. Camilla might even pay you. That didn't last long. Volunteers became so plentiful that some of them even began suggesting that they pay Camilla. The only limit is imagination. Across the country at the Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts, Thomas Mulholland, a research psychologist, had been conducting feedback studies in electroencephalography for nearly a decade. Dr. Mulholland stated, "What we've done is to attach a subject to the EEG and the EEG switch to the switch of a slide projector. When the subject is relaxed, voltage from the alpha rhythm activates the switch and the projector beams a picture on the screen. When he looks at the picture, he becomes alert, the alpha waves diminish and the switch is turned off." He went on to say that this feedback principle was the same as that controlling the working of a thermostat. When the temperature of a room falls below a certain point, the thermostat turns the furnace on. When the heat from the furnace raises the temperature sufficiently, the thermostat turns the furnace off.
Need inspiration? Shop Ralph's for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouth-watering meals with savings beyond low prices, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Ralph's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
We've locked in low prices to help you save big store-wide. Look for the locked in low prices tags and enjoy extra savings throughout the store. Ralph's, fresh for everyone.
Off. Our thermostat is the EEG machine, temperature, the attention level, furnace, the slide projector. When the level of attention is low, the projector goes on. When the level of attention is high, the projector goes off. The advantage of this system, according to Dr. Mulholland, was that the subject learned to control his own attention level. At this point, we've only begun to scratch the surface, he continued. When the potential sophistication of feedback EEG first occurred to us, some people taught themselves to send Morse code by controlling their alpha. Now we are facing more practical applications. For instance, a teaching machine with feedback providing reward for continued viewing might well improve learning. Also, it could be applied as an attention trainer, both to enhance a student's retentive abilities and to evaluate the effectiveness of various visual aids. A few subjects have, through increased voluntary control over their alpha rhythms, successfully achieved a state of controlled consciousness similar to that obtained in yoga. In other words, they were able to turn on. So it may be possible to teach people how to increase their awareness of and control over all physiological processes associated with a relaxed mental state. Really, practical applications of feedback electroencephalography are limited only by the human imagination. However, not everybody is able to produce a recordable alpha. We don't know why, but we draw blanks on approximately 8% of those we test. In addition, there is quite a variance in alphas. Some can barely be picked up on the EEG, while others, well, we have one woman whose alpha is so strong, I swear I can almost hear it. A cosmic symphony. At the Veterans Hospital in Sepulveda, California, Dr. Barbara Brown had put together an intricate and sophisticated feedback system. Her subjects could, for instance, witness a fascinating light show, the colors and designs of which were governed by their particular brainwave patterns. The moods and imagery of the individual mind thus were reflected by specific colors and rhythms, the pace and tempo of which could be conducted on a pre-conscious level by the person's deep-seated emotions, desires, or anxieties. Dr. Brown described herself as very enthusiastic about feedback. She saw it being applied for relaxation, developing athletic skills, problem-solving, preventative medicine, anxiety control, accelerated learning, and something even more startling. Personally, she stated, I think feedback may be the great white hope for extrasensory perception. She cautioned that nobody could be sure at this point, however. Nevertheless, the intriguing possibility remained. Vast powers of the mind might be opened up through brainwave control. Man had been trying to learn about himself for centuries, and maybe what brainwave control indicated was that for the first time, means were available for the individual to find out about himself. Carl Rogers had talked of the self-image conflict that many people had. Most of us did not really know what we were like, nor did we know what we should be like. Now at last an instrument may have been acquired that could reflect our inner essence in the same way that a mirror reflected our outer behavior. It couldn't have happened at a better time, for self-hate seemed about to explode the world. If man could learn to know himself and control himself and improve himself, he might even learn to like himself. With the help of a small camera and high-speed film, I was able to bring home for study copies of many of the papers which caught my interest. Thus my lights burned far into the night, giving me opportunity for reflection on the vast and unexplored area of human consciousness which I was entering. As I reviewed the history of human accomplishment, that familiar chronology of wars and repressions and exploitations seemed to be fading away, and what appeared to be growing on the face of the earth was a gigantic laboratory of mind. A challenge worthy of Merlin. Up to the moment, the history of the study of the mind had reflected little in the way of achievement. Freudian psychoanalysis had proven a long and costly business, and its glittering baubles of success, security, and peace of mind were attained mostly by the therapists themselves. Recently, there had been some hope in new forms of psychotherapy, nearly all of which rejected or ignored the ideas of Sigmund Freud. Encounter group therapy, in all its many guises, Esalen, Elysium Synanon, was a lot cheaper than analysis and a lot more fun. It even seemed to do some people some good. Behavior therapy, the Pavlovian punishment reward system, made no attempt to determine a cause and went single-mindedly after the symptom itself. It wasn't as much fun as encounter therapy, but it was fast and had established an impressive record of effectiveness. Its more sophisticated counterpart, cybernetics, had proven most effective of all, but, as I had recently discovered, dealt with only half the individual and could not relieve his existential distress. How to put the two halves together? That was the question, for the subconscious had never been amenable to exploration. Mystical, shrouded, and unknown, in it the key to man's nature must surely lie. Hypnosis seemed to demonstrate the workings of the unconscious better than any other mental technique. Freud is reported to have abandoned hypnosis when he saw the Pandora's box it opened in the subconscious. The subconscious seemed to be capable of acting as if any idea were true, regardless of how bizarre that idea might be. The extraordinary power of the subconscious to maintain a harmful belief, despite all evidence to the contrary, seemed just that mental area where light was most urgently needed. Positive thinking had not alleviated this problem, but rather had given widespread endorsement to the premise that in order for something to be a certain way, all one had to do was believe it was that way. It is difficult to imagine a more regressive development. Even the savage dancing around the campfire to bring rain couldn't be talked into that. He knew he had to do something. Confidence and optimism, of course, were strong psychological precursors of effective action, but unless confidence and optimism were based upon a realistic appraisal of the facts, they were little more than wind. People who rushed into oncoming trains with the utmost confidence of demolishing the trains seldom were reported as demolishing the trains, though they themselves were unlikely to be heard from further. The man in a mental ward announcing he was Napoleon exhibited every bit as much confidence as the international industrialist announcing the building of a new factory. The real and the unreal, there was the conflict. I recalled the words of my dream, syzygy to serendipity. The putting together of opposites leads to the fortunate finding of things not looked for. But how could one put together the real and the unreal? That seemed a challenge worthy of Merlin. Let us learn to dream, gentlemen. McKellar and Simpson, in an investigation of hypnagogic imagery, reported that their subjects described images which seemed to differ from dreams, in that they were more vivid and more realistic. Also, they come and go in a flash, and resemble lantern slides, and contain detailed material which I didn't know I knew. These subjects reported four main characteristics of hypnagogic images. A. Vividness. B. Independence of conscious control. C. Originality. D. Changefulness. The authors commented that hypnagogic images merit investigation in that they may represent an instance in which greater knowledge of the normal may illumine the abnormal. Such hypnagogic images seemed remarkably similar to those described by Uell as leading to his theory of molecular constitution. One fine summer evening I was returning by the last omnibus, outside as usual, through the deserted streets of the metropolis, which are at other times so full of life. I fell into a reverie and lo, the atoms were gambling before my eyes. Whenever hitherto these diminutive beings had appeared to me, they had always been in motion, but up to that time, I had never been able to discern the nature of their motion. Now, however, I saw how frequently two smaller atoms united to form a pair, how larger one embraced two smaller ones, how still larger ones kept hold of three or even four of the smaller, whilst the whole kept whirling in a giddy dance. I saw how the larger ones formed a chain. I spent the greater part of the night putting on paper at least sketches of these dream forms. Later he recorded the finale. I turned my chair to the fire and dozed. Again, the atoms were gambling before my eyes. This time the smaller groups kept modestly in the background. My mental eye, rendered more acute by repeated visions of this kind, could now distinguish larger structures of manifold conformation. Long rows, sometimes closely fitted together, all turning and twisting in a snake-like motion. But look, what was that? One of the snakes had seized hold of its own tail, and the form whirled mockingly before my eyes. As if by a flash of lightning I awoke. With this dream symbol of the snake biting its tail, Uell was enabled to make the discovery that some organic compounds occur in closed chains or rings. Small wonder, he urged his contemporaries. Let us learn to dream, gentlemen. Behind the doorway of dreams. That statement plunged into my heart like a dagger, for I suddenly realized that for all of my adult life, I had been trying to stifle my dreams. Odd, how you can live with something so long that you no longer recognize it. Oh, you call its name, only it isn't that name, it's something different, and when it turns out to be part of you, you're a stranger to yourself. Everyone had always told me that I was imaginative. I even thought so myself. After all, hadn't I written short stories and novels and screenplays and television dramas? Surely one had to be imaginative to do that. Writing novels is just about as suppressed as imagination can be, almost as suppressed as writing short stories, screenplays, and television dramas. It is possible to imagine anything. At that moment, I knew for certain that the key that unlocked the mysteries of life lay behind the doorway of dreams. I didn't know that I was stifling my dreams before Uell, but I knew I was doing something. What I called it was being a realist. I thought this meant dealing with things as they really are. I didn't realize it meant dealing with things as other people think they are. If I really wanted to have imagination, I had to carry imagination to its limit. I had to remove every resistance against imagination, having absolute freedom. I had to cease at once being a realist. How then could I be sure that I wouldn't be swallowed by imagination? Why, I had to have balance. I had to be so sure of what was real that I could be as unreal as I wanted to be and still keep my balance. I had to nail down some facts in the material world upon which I could absolutely depend and on which I could build support lines. I had to have such confidence in those facts and support lines that I could lower myself over the precipice of imagination and let myself down into the chasm of ignorance as far as I could go. If I could do that, sooner or later, I was bound to discover what was hidden in the chasm. Take those hypnagogic images, like dreaming that a pearl was born through my chest and seeing the violet-jacketed man on the pier. They were clear as reality, even clearer, yet I had persisted in thinking of them as mere imaginations, at best, inspirations. What if there was reality in those images? A reality as great, perhaps even greater than the physical world. What if truth lay somewhere between physical reality and imagination? What if there existed some point of balance between absolute reality and absolute fantasy that was a source of immeasurable power? Such ideas were already making me uncomfortable. So far out did they seem. But the die was cast now, and I knew there was no retreat. However far my imagination carried me, I knew I had an anchor in the physical world and would not be engulfed. That anchor was reason. Reason may seem an insubstantial anchor to some, but I knew it would hold in the shifting tides for me, because I'd been testing it all of my life. Before I could accept anything as real, It had to make sense. That meant it had to be perceivable by the five senses, and it had to add up. Imagination alone could never convince me that it was reality. My senses and logic were too well anchored in the physical. Realizing this gave me a sudden feeling of freedom and security, as of a child who had developed faith in his sense of direction, and knew that no matter how far away he wandered, he'd always be able to return home. The 4 stages of sleep. First off, it was necessary to come to a better understanding of hypnagogic images, and the best place to explore these, or so it seemed, was in my own mind. I must begin paying close attention to my dreams and discovering those images that occupied my sleeping consciousness, what the significance of those images were, how I might best use them, alter them, and otherwise control them for a greater understanding of life. Research into the nature of dreaming had been mostly a matter of correlation between the electroencefalogram, EEG, and rapid eye movement, REM. According to the EEG, there were 4 different stages of sleep. Stage 1 consisted of an irregular mixture of theta waves, 4-7 CPS, alpha-like activity, waves 1 to 2 CPS slower than the subject's waking alpha, and occasional alpha waves, 8-13 CPS. Stage 2 contained spindle activity, 14 CPS, in addition to the above, and stages 3 and 4 contained increasingly larger proportions, up to 100% of delta waves, 1-3 CPS, in addition to spindle activity. Exact divisions between stages 2, 3, and 4 were arbitrary, based on the percentage of delta waves in each. The stage 1 pattern was readily distinguishable from the other stages by its total lack of spindles and delta waves. When subjects were in stage 1 sleep, they unconsciously signaled the experimenter of this fact by rapid movement of their eyes under closed eyelids. Awakened, they unanimously reported that they were dreaming. When awakened from any other stage of sleep, they reported no dreams. It was therefore stage 1 sleep, with its rapid eye movement and dreams, that was of principal interest. The literature showed that stage 1 sleep alternated with the other stages in a more or less regular fashion throughout the night, with a period of dreaming occurring approximately every 90 minutes, and each dream period running somewhat longer than its predecessor. For example, the initial dream period ran about 10 minutes for most subjects, while the 4th or 5th might run nearly an hour. Altogether, stage 1 dreaming occupied between 20% and 30% of the total sleep time of most young adults, spread over 3 to 6 stage 1 periods. Of a special significance were experiments in which subjects had been deprived of dream time, but not sleep time. They simply were awakened at the first sign of rapid eye movement and stage 1 EEG signals, so that no dreaming could occur. After 72 hours of such dream deprivation, nearly all subjects were exhibiting psychotic symptoms ranging from paranoia to schizophrenia. Apparently, the dream mechanism of the human brain performed some powerful integrating function, and this was exactly the clue I was looking for. I resolved at once to devise some method for better recall of my own dreams. A simple method of investigating dreams. I knew that when I fell asleep, the magic lantern of my mind turned on at once. This is to say that when the first warm sensations of sleep began creeping over my body, there was an accompanying increase in the vividness of the imagery occupying my inner attention, so that as falling asleep progressed, entire scenes were cast up in complete detail. I had no need to make up anything. It was all there. I was simply observing it. Then, of a sudden, some strange alteration of identification would take place, and the dream no longer seemed a dream. Now it seemed real. This was the borderline I was after, that fine line between reality and unreality, where imagination brought to the physical world its most creative solutions. There was danger, of course, for hadn't Nietzsche and Van Gogh plumbed these depths too, and hadn't they both gone mad? But I felt that the danger was simply that they had entered too far into the unconscious, without an anchor in reality. This I hoped to circumvent by refusing to accept as real anything that was not physically demonstrable and repeatable. Thus resolved, I was left only with the necessity of devising a technique for exploring my dreams. The one I settled upon was simple. From the very first moment of my contact with brainwave mechanics, I had been taken by the feeling that the unusual effects surrounding the production of alpha waves were due to some balancing influence being exerted over both body and brain. Through my familiarity with computer technology, I knew of the periodic synchronizing pulse which all computers had to employ in order that the firing potential of each storage cell be kept at optimum levels. Without that synchronizing pulse, cell potentials varied widely, and the computer would begin making errors. Something of the same nature seemed to be going on in the brain through the medium of the alpha rhythm, for when sleepers were deprived of dreaming, in other words, deprived of alpha-theta time, they began making errors about what was real and unreal, exhibiting psychotic tendencies. The word which kept occurring to me over and over was balance. The idea of balance gave me the methodology for investigating my dreams. I simply fell asleep on my back with my right forearm pointing upward and resting on its elbow on the bed in perfect balance. When sleep began to overtake me, the arm would lose balance and begin to fall toward the bed, and this sensation would awaken me with perfect recall of what I happened to be dreaming. Chapter 3. Door to the Subconscious Mind. Dr. Jean hadn't set eyes on me for 5 years, and he let me know that I'd changed. "You're fat," he said, "and you smell of tobacco. What are you trying to do? Kill yourself." I mumbled a dissent and tried to accustom myself to the plush decor. Dr. Jean had been moving up in the world, and I found myself struck by the notion that I would be.
What's your credit card debt balance? If it's $10,000 or more, here are 3 easy solutions you can start implementing today. And number 3 is an absolute game changer. Number 1, the first step to tackling your credit card debt is understanding how much debt you actually have and how long it could follow you around for if you're only making minimum payments or have fallen behind. Minimum payments could literally keep you in debt for decades. $10,000 in debt can take anywhere from 14 to 26 years to pay off if you're only paying the minimums. And that's just $10,000. I know many of us have a lot more than that. Number 2, try this popular method to tackle debt. Start with minimum payments to stay current on all your cards. Then take any additional money you can afford and put all of it towards your smallest debt until it's paid off. By paying off your smallest debt first, you'll likely eliminate the most interest in the shortest amount of time. Then work your way up, knocking out one debt at a time until you're debt-free. Number 3, and this one is a game changer. Anyone with $10,000 or more in credit card debt or personal loans may qualify for help from National Debt Relief. Getting started is easy, and the process has already helped over 500,000 people and counting.
I was on the computer working on something. What caught my eye was a little shield, red, white, and blue shield, and it said National Debt Relief. And I called immediately. Congratulations, you qualify to be a part of the National Debt Relief Program. And you're not alone. And that shame left. I cried. I'm debt free. Wow, I can't thank National Debt Relief enough. I can't thank them enough.
This is not too good to be true. I had an end date. I got the email, it said, "Congratulations, you are now debt free." I still was like in disbelief about it. I can't even, it was such a release. My relationship is much better now. There is this entire stress that is completely gone. I'm debt free.
I am debt free.
Find out if you're eligible today. Click the link on this video and answer a few short questions. If you have $10,000 or more in debt, there's a good chance you'll qualify. But don't wait. Be sure to apply before next Friday. Go ahead and click that link. You'll be glad you did.
Okay, wait, hold on. Look, I still feel like we can both get what we want here.
So, what's your deal?
I've got this condition where I don't feel pain.
You're a superhero.
No.
You're not Wolverine. You can still die.
What is that?
Why?
Novocaine.
Oh my God!
Come on! Huge Home Alone fans, apparently.
Be paying part of the rent. "Take off your clothes," he ordered, "and lie down on the table." He at once began a process of prodding, probing, squeezing, jabbing, peering, listening, measuring, and weighing, which eventually revealed to his practiced eye the kind of shape I was in. It wasn't so good. I was many pounds overweight, weighing 237, a figure I couldn't believe myself. My blood pressure was up, my pulse was too high, and I had difficulty getting my breath. After I'd put on my clothes, he shook my hand warmly. So many funerals to go to lately. If you don't mind, I'll say goodbye now." As he showed me to the door, he suggested that I probably could prolong my stay on the planet by taking off 50 pounds and giving up cigarettes. Before I knew it, I was standing in the hallway, $100 poorer and far from serene. Right on the spot, I gave up smoking and went on a diet. 4 hours later, I ate a steak dinner and started smoking again. An electronic wizard. Oh, I knew I should do something about my smoking and eating, but it seemed too much trouble. After all, I was 50 years old and couldn't be expected to look like a teenager. Besides, doctors were confirmed alarmists, and cigarette smoking probably wasn't nearly as bad as everybody said. I had to remember that Dr. Jean hadn't found anything seriously wrong, at least nothing that needed an operation. By the time I got through reconstructing the interview, I could almost believe he'd given me a clean bill of health. Anyway, I was on a new tack now. Since then, I'd bumped into an electronics wizard, and he was going to build me an EEG machine. Nothing fancy, of course, not like the giants found in neurological clinics. But my wizard felt that he could miniaturize the works and put them in a cigar box and make them go beep when they were picking up alpha. The whole thing would cost maybe $400. That sounded cheap at the price. A regular EEG could cost over $5,000. It took 3 weeks for him to fit the pieces together, and he demonstrated it on his own head. When I first saw him sitting there, wired for sound, electrodes leading from head to box, I couldn't help a feeling of ridiculousness. I consoled myself that plenty of people were already staring at boxes with shadows on them, so it shouldn't hurt to get hooked up to one. The wizard was handy at producing alpha. He really made the box sing. I calculated offhand that, with his eyes closed, he was producing alpha about 80% of the time. He showed me how the switches and knobs worked, how the electrodes were pasted to the scalp. Then he hooked me up, and we waited for the beep. There was an embarrassing silence. He fooled with knobs, adjusting things, and I tried again. This time there were several lonely beeps, so we knew the machine was working all right. I wasn't about to lose face further, since the wizard was already looking at me oddly. So I paid him his money, picked up the alpha meter, and took it home, all the while hoping that I wasn't in that 8% that couldn't produce alpha. Experimenting with the alpha meter. The alpha meter was powered by 2 radio batteries, so I took to carrying it around the house while hooked up to it, hoping thereby to get some clue as to how alpha was manufactured. Every now and then, the thing would let loose with a series of beeps, even though my eyes were open. But for the life of me, I couldn't put my finger on what caused them. And much of the time, even with my eyes closed, I got no beep at all. The harder I tried, the greater the silence. Much of this I expected, but as always, there was a vast difference between intellectual understanding and actual experience. Brainwave literature had been explicit about the fact that the production of alpha depended on one's ability to develop passive volition, that kind of volition that permitted an event to transpire rather than ordering it to happen. This passive volition was as elusive as mercury. No matter how I placed my fingers on it, I soon started to squeeze, and the mercury scooted away. Since the permissive method of accomplishing something seemed so foreign to my nature, I was led to the conclusion that a good deal of my conditioning had been toward the end of holding back rather than letting go. In short, it was inhibitory rather than excitatory. The physical picture of such a situation is that the firing threshold of each neuron in a circuit is excessively high, and it therefore takes an extraordinary stimulus to cause it to fire. Persons with such high firing thresholds appear inhibited, since they do not react to the ordinary events that transpire around them, seeming wooden, non-expressive, apathetic, disinterested. Those appellations are scarcely designed to win personality contests, though they might perhaps be of service if one were undergoing torture and wanted to keep secrets. Since such exigencies seldom arise in our modern society, excessive inhibition produces no noticeable service either to the individual or his peers, and he does both himself and them a service by getting rid of it. Andrew Salter, a New York psychologist, practically founded a religion on this one point alone. Cloistered with my machine, I sat for hours, trying to relax my mind and body so as to produce alpha beeps, attempting every conceivable manner of mental gymnastics, from the mindlessness of Zen to the ecstatic visions of mysticism. And still I could not reach a consistent alpha baseline, which is to say that what alpha I produced was both sparse and sporadic. Much as I hate defeatist attitude, I finally accepted the conclusion that I was one of those cases that simply would never be a high alpha producer. I disconnected myself from my newly acquired machine and ruefully wrote off the money I paid for it. Then an interesting thing happened. The vibrating universe. I developed a muscular spasm in the lower part of my back and used a vibrator to dissolve it. I'd stumbled across this therapy several years before, after I'd become convinced that muscular spasms were unconsciously controlled and represented an extreme case of protective armoring against threat. The works of Wilhelm Reich had enlightened me in this regard, and they had taught me that while approaching such spasms in a psychological manner could be costly and time-consuming, those spasms yielded quickly before the soothing effects of heat and vibration. Experience itself had shown me that the worst of my backaches would dissolve under a half-hour session with the vibrator, and this case proved no different. At the end of it, simply because I felt relaxed, I rehooked myself to the alpha meter. To my astonishment, I immediately began producing a strong alpha baseline. For 15 minutes, until my inner tensions began to reassert themselves, I was able to continue this strong alpha production and to experience sensations which I hadn't undergone since a child. These were so delightful that at the moment I could only describe them as joy. After the session was over, I was able to further refine them as being allied to feelings of freedom, security, and confidence. Through the medium of the vibrator, I not only had broken through the inhibitions producing the muscular spasm in my back, I had also broken through the inhibitions in my own brain structure, which were preventing me from producing a strong alpha rhythm. Apparently, the mechanism of vibration was closely allied to brain waves. Though the effect was astonishing, once I stopped to analyze it, it came as no surprise. I had known for years that we live in a vibrating universe, and that differences in rates of vibration account for all we know of matter, space, time, color, light, and sound. The senses themselves are little more than devices for picking up certain prescribed ranges of vibration and carrying these to the brain, where they are translated into the images that we come to regard as the forms and events of life. In this rarefied area, where physics and metaphysics blend, all is seen to be in an intense state of flux. Matter appears to be non-existent, and energy seems but an attribute of a master intelligence. Dissolving the muscular armor. After this experience, I resumed my alpha meter sessions, always preceding them by a session with the vibrator. Optimum times with each appeared to be 30 minutes with the vibrator and 30 minutes with the alpha meter. While working with the vibrator, I concentrated on relaxing all parts of my body until not a single area of tension remained. Though in principle this sounds easy, I found it difficult to actually do. However, my acquaintance with Reichian therapy proved helpful. It was Reich's theory that the individual unconsciously designed for himself a muscular armor around transverse sections of the backbone in order to prevent the free flow of life energy along the spine. These muscular armoring were all designed to prevent the occurrence of the orgasm reflex.
Without the ones like you working tirelessly to keep things running, everything would suddenly stop. No matter your industry, Grainger's here for you with professional-grade supplies. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
For in Reich's view, all living functioning was the result of that reflex. That's the way the heart beat, the lungs and liver worked, the pancreas, stomach, and intestines functioned, and that's the way life reproduced itself. Since most of the early training of the individual had to do with inhibiting the orgasm reflex, a muscular armor gradually was set up around his spine and began to function unconsciously, manifesting first as reduced energy, then as aches and pains, then as disease and malfunction. Since Reishi techniques for dissolving this muscular armoring took the form of stretching the musculature around each segment of the spine, I began preceding my vibrator session with about 15 minutes of yoga postures. These are stretching exercises and are the opposite of the more traditional form of exercise, which seeks to bunch muscles and to tire them. Stretching neither tires muscles nor drains their energy away. Conversely, it rejuvenates and activates, as witness the feeling of well-being that follows immediately after the natural stretching that one does on awakening in the morning. I now began to develop a regimen for alpha training. On arising in the morning, I first would do 15 minutes of yoga exercises. Then I would spend 30 minutes sitting with the length of my spine against the vibrator. Following this, I would spend 30 minutes hooked up to the alpha meter, working at increasing my alpha production as well as the amplitude of the waves themselves. In addition, I would try to slow my alpha rhythm, leading it downward from its normal range of about 12 cycles per second toward the alpha-theta border of 8 cycles per second, for that was the hypnagogic area. After adopting this schedule, my progress was steady, if not spectacular. Cause and effect. Meantime, a great number of ideas were circulating through my mind, and I was literally in an intellectual whirl at the many concepts that were now falling into place. For example, the close association of alpha waves with a relaxed mental and physical state, an association which I had now proven beyond doubt, was pregnant with deeper meaning. Brain waves are electrical currents and manifest as a pulse denoting a flow of energy from a positive pole to a negative pole, then from negative to positive. The rate at which electricity flows is determined by the pressure differential between polarities and the resistance which the flow of that electricity encounters in the conductor. So, as far as strengthening my alpha waves was concerned, two things were immediately apparent. I must try to establish widely differing pressures at opposite polarities of my inner electrical works, and I must lower my resistance to the flow of energy between them. At first, I could see no way of increasing the pressure differential between polarities, but I thought I could perceive methods of lowering resistance to the flow of energy between them. My experience with the vibrator helped me here, and also some knowledge of the history of electricity. The first power plants employed direct current generators. So inefficient was this method of power transmission that a separate power plant would be needed for each square mile of the cities we know today, and would be far beyond the bounds of economic feasibility. Interestingly, a well-known and respected inventor, Thomas Edison, was responsible for the development of the direct current system, while a little-known and not-so-respected inventor, Nikola Tesla, designed the alternating current system in worldwide use today. Tesla, as anyone knows who is familiar with the facts of his life, was a genius. In the Edison-Tesla dispute lay a lesson. Electrical current was not most efficiently transmitted by pressure alone, but rather by rhythm, an alternating pulsation. Therefore, in the matter of increasing my own alpha output, I seemed least likely to achieve results by trying to achieve them, exerting pressure, and most likely to obtain them by getting into rhythm with whatever source was producing those brainwaves. Such a conclusion, seemingly simple enough to arrive at, nevertheless was to have the most revolutionary consequences for both my attitudes and lifestyle. Like most people, I had been brought up from earliest childhood to believe that I caused effects in my environment. That statement undoubtedly sounds like the ABC of reality, but now that I had started to question it, I suddenly saw that it was based on the flimsiest of assumptions. Simply because my consciousness happened to be the center of my environment was no reason at all to assume that it was responsible for the effects that existed there, or even that it could be responsible for that matter. Paradise lost. I certainly didn't feel that I could alter the course of the celestial galaxies, or the Earth's orbit around the Sun, or the moons around the Earth, or stay the tides, or change the weather. Those things I lived in accord with, accustomed myself to the rhythm of, attuned myself to, worked in conjunction with. But when that environment drew in close enough, so that it became a nearby house or tree or animal or person, I at once was overtaken by the feeling that I could affect it, and what's more, affect it any way I chose. Just let the objects in my environment be small enough and close enough, and I was seized by the sensation that I was the determiner of their fate, that I was the cause of their future. Yet the simplest reflection on the matter revealed the inescapable fact that I myself was but an effect in that environment, produced by some unknown and mysterious cause. I tried to remember the last time I had gone about doing anything with the idea of attuning myself to it, rather than trying to control it, and I couldn't remember a single instance in my entire adult life. I searched my childhood memories, and finally came upon a day, a misty, overcast day, which lighted the ponds and sloughs of rolling farmlands, an enchanted place where riverbank caves were inhabited by gnomes, and nymphs cavorted in the waters, and dew-laden air was riven by the flight of sylphs, and high above the clouds rode the sun drawn by a team of fiery salamanders. The world was magic, and I was an awed spectator. How had that bliss been lost? Why, somehow I had divided myself from the world and then sought to control it. The effort of making no effort. So now when I sat down for my session of feedback training with the alpha meter, my entire effort was to make no effort, but rather to get into rhythm with the pulse beat of life, to permit rather than to control, to feel myself in contact with that very power that actuated the alpha waves themselves. No sooner had I managed to come close to this inner condition than I became conscious of tensions all over my body. There was a spasm between my shoulder blades, another in the solar plexus, still another in the small of the back. What was unusual about these spasms is that they existed where formerly I had thought I was totally relaxed. So I knew at once that they were both chronic and below the level of consciousness. For years, perhaps nearly half a century, I had been maintaining a tightly controlled muscular tension in certain parts of my body. Why? To prevent something from happening. But what? Whatever might happen. A gold-headed walking stick was raised in the air and then banged down on the boards of the jetty. Not irreversible, intoned the violet-jacketed man. Not yet, at least. 45 years of muscular spasms in order to prevent spontaneity. And all I had to show for it was an aching back. Well, goodbye, aching back. Hello, spontaneity. But it wasn't as easy as it sounded. Taking in and giving out. In the first place, those muscular spasms weren't anxious to dissolve. They'd lived there so long that no doubt they felt entitled to squatters' rights. Sessions with the vibrator and yoga exercises were able to dissolve them temporarily, so at least I had a taste of what it felt like to be free and alive. But before many hours passed in the workaday world, I could sense that gremlins had crept back into customary spots and once more were gumming up the works. Perhaps the primary contribution of Sigmund Freud to the understanding of man was his hypothesis that it is helpful in trying to change a psychological effect if one knows the cause of that effect. If I were subconsciously maintaining muscular tension in some parts of my body, that muscular tension had once served a purpose, and if I could determine what that purpose was, perhaps I could discover what I was doing internally to maintain the tension. Now when something is made tense in the human body, it is either to prevent taking in or giving out. If my original purpose in creating that muscular tension was to prevent taking in, then I had maintained the tension to keep something out. If my original purpose in creating that muscular tension was to prevent giving out, then I had maintained the tension to keep something in. Of course, once the tension had become chronic, it naturally restricted both taking in and giving out. But which had I originally been afraid of? I tried to remember. Right off, it seemed difficult to believe that I could ever have been afraid of taking in, no matter how buried in my subconscious such a memory might be. All my life I'd been avidly taking in new knowledge, and I'd always taken in plenty of food, and now I was even taking in smoke. Balancing the two forces. I tried to picture a person whose muscular armor was arranged to prevent taking in. What would be his primary characteristics? Why, he would be defensive, suspicious, and hostile, would he not? He would tend to be unteachable, and would probably gravitate into police work or the military services, where suspicion and hostility would be useful. It was difficult to equate my past with such a person. I'd been a loner, a Deutscherselfer.
Target made Good and Gather for you, helping you save on delicious salads, chopped and ready. For quick, easy meals. Everyday favorites at unbeatable prices. We made Good and Gather for you, only at Target.
Why had I been a loner? Because I felt I could only be myself when I was by myself. Why did I feel that way? Because when I was with other people, I couldn't express my real feelings. Why couldn't I express my real feelings? Because people wouldn't understand them. Clearly, my muscular spasms had been created by long practice at keeping my feelings inside. If there was a button that controlled the human psyche, mine was set on hold in. All these years I'd been on the take, bent out of balance because I couldn't give. And even my taking had been restricted by the very same armor that prevented my giving. Oh, I'd tried to give, no question about it. But such efforts had been awkward and tense, and a deep emotional drain. Looking back on them, I could see quite clearly how often I had exhausted myself by trying to overcome my resistance to giving. Now, instead of overcoming it, I saw the possibility of dissolving it. At this prospect of liberation from a lifelong prison, I felt profound excitement. Now my sessions with the vibrator took on deeper purpose, for I carefully applied heat and vibration to just those areas where my subconscious mind was chronically holding my muscles in spasm. A glimpse of the philosopher's stone. I set the vibrator at 10 cycles per second while I worked at the muscular spasms between my shoulder blades, in the small of my back, and in my solar plexus. Following the first of these sessions, I hooked up the alpha sensor and immediately began producing an alpha baseline of 80%, high-amplitude waves, gradually slowing from 12 cycles per second to the alpha-theta border of 8 cycles per second. This slowing down of frequency and increase in amplitude I attributed to my inner state of mind, for I felt that my consciousness was flowing out from my body and diffusing through space. It was a heady feeling, one of high vibration and intense lucidity. I finished the alpha session feeling better than I'd ever felt in my life, and in a far different way than I had ever thought it was possible to feel. Light, airy, clear, effervescent. That evening, I had a dream in which the man in the violet jacket visited me and showed me an unusual jewel. It was a large stone set in spun gold and apparently designed as a brooch. Deep indigo in color, it was cut strangely and had the quality of lightening its hue into the upper ranges of violet. And this changefulness gave it a living quality, the more so since the stone was highly polished. It resembled no gem I had ever seen before, so I asked the violet-jacketed man what it was called. "The philosopher's stone," he answered. I reached out to take it and woke up. The experience left me vaguely distressed, and though it was 3 in the morning, nevertheless I arose and wandered about the apartment, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee. I had a feeling of intense frustration, as if an opportunity had been given me and I had failed to measure up. Reviewing the dream, I could see no immediate place where I might have behaved differently, and to actually have seen the fabled philosopher's stone, even though only in a dream, should have been exciting. But my depression persisted. It was only when I decided to do some work with the vibrator and the alpha meter that I suddenly became aware of how I had failed in the dream. I had reached out to take when I should have been seeking some way to give. The realization so upset me that I tried to fall asleep and once more pick up the dream, but the dream did not recur. The alpha-theta border. Now I was rapidly reaching the point in alpha training where I was producing close to 100% baseline in the eyes closed position and about 30% baseline with eyes open. Eyes open alpha had been reported in the literature only by Zen masters and yogis, and I felt sure I was getting close to a mental breakthrough. During the sessions, as my brainwaves increased in strength and slowed in frequency, sliding down to the alpha-theta border, my consciousness focused on vivid mental images, as real as any in the actual world. I seemed able to hold a single image in mind indefinitely, entering into it, exploring a million ramifications, seeing within the image, however mundane it might be, whether of a tree, a flower, a street, a person, the whole kaleidoscope of evolving and unfolding life. I knew I was reaching a point in meditation that formerly had been available to practitioners only after years of the most arduous and painstaking apprenticeship. I now was able to start my alpha rhythm when I chose, to stop it, to increase or lower its amplitude, to speed it up or slow it down, to keep it on with eyes open, and I was satisfied that I had achieved conscious control over this formerly unconscious process of my brain. I knew that I would now need only occasional sessions with the alpha meter to reinforce my control. So my alpha conditioning was completed. How long had it taken me? From the very start, I had kept a log, and this log revealed that I had spent 18.5 hours hooked up to the alpha meter. This figure was much higher than the average conditioning time reported by other experimenters. But then I had been one of that unfortunate 8% that reported little or no alpha to begin with, so I felt that my progress had been satisfactory. Each alpha session was a half hour in length, and 37 of them were recorded, spread out over a 6-week period. The log. June 22nd. First session with the alpha meter. Had some difficulty making the electrode connections. Grease or dirt on the skin is best removed with alcohol for a clean electrode contact. This contact must be bound by moisture. Regular EKG, electrocardiograph, paste excellent for this purpose. Optimum electrode placement is one terminal centered on the forehead and the other 2 inches above the posterior base of the skull. Care must be taken with this latter placement so that hair doesn't interfere with the contact. No problem in my case. Spent 10 minutes adjusting sensor to pick up my alpha activity. Received nothing. June 22nd. Tried another session the same day with equally discouraging results. If I hadn't seen my electronic wizard make this thing hum, I'd think there was something wrong with it. June 23rd. Spent 15 minutes trying to produce alpha and couldn't. Turned up sensitivity and audio so I could pick up beta. It was reassuring to hear something going on inside my skull. That rapid 22 cycle per minute pulse was almost a continuous sound and rather unnerving. Anyway, at least I know the machine is working. Resolved to work only for alpha from now on. June 24th. Visualized peaceful images. Tried to think of the times I'd been happiest. Worked up excitement. Tried feeling drowsy. Generated feelings of fear, love, passion, hate, boredom, interest. Nothing. Just a few isolated beeps which I couldn't tie to anything. They just seemed to happen. Pretty discouraging. We'll lay off for a couple of days. June 27th. Couldn't face up to another half hour of just sitting there waiting for something to happen. So hooked myself up to the alpha meter and carried it around the apartment, going about my usual activities. I read, sharpened pencils, wrote letters, paid bills, shaved, brushed teeth, went to the bathroom, always hoping to receive some kind of electronic signature for these mundane activities. But all I received were occasional alpha beeps occurring at the most unexpected times for no apparent reason, and seemingly with no less frequency than in the eyes closed position. Jim came by and saw me hooked up, asked in all seriousness, "You having heart trouble? Is that a pacemaker?" I told him it was a pacemaker for the brain. Now he thinks I'm a real kook. Chronology of a breakthrough. June 28th. Sat another half hour without making progress. I'm exactly where I started. Maybe it's about time I admitted I can't produce alpha. Just an 8%er. Member of a minority group. Wonder if I'll be discriminated against? June 29th. Another fruitless session. But I noticed one thing. I can't keep my mind from wandering. Hops all over the place, like a monkey playing with jumping beans. June 30th. Very discouraged and about ready to chuck the whole thing. Wish I had my $400 back. July 5th. The most exciting thing happened. Went swimming at Malibu over the holidays and a wave caught me and strained my back. That itself wasn't so exciting. But when I got home, first thing I did was plop myself down on the vibrator to get rid of the pain and the soreness. After I'd gotten relief, thought I'd give the alpha meter another try. To my surprise, I immediately began producing a strong alpha rhythm. Kept up for 15 minutes before tailing off. Forced to conclude that the vibrator had something to do with it. July 6th. Tried alpha meter without the vibrator. No results. Spent a half hour with the vibrator, then hooked up to the alpha meter again. Began producing powerful alpha at once. No coincidence this time. The vibrator is breaking down some inner resistance and allowing me to generate alpha. July 7th. Experimented with using the vibrator and the alpha meter at the same time. Produced steady alpha from the start, though not as strong as when using the alpha meter after a vibrator session. Thought I could perceive some kind of synchronization between alpha production and the vibrations of the vibrator. Curious sensation. July 8th. Half hour on the vibrator and half hour on the alpha meter. Will be my regular routine from now on. Strong alpha throughout whole session, better than 50% baseline, good amplitude, tailing off a little at the end. Very encouraging. Several times it seemed as though I was establishing some sort of control, though what that control was and how it worked, I couldn't say. Contact with the force field. July 9th. Good alpha. Becoming aware of deep-lying areas of muscular tension. Reaction, armoring. These seem chronic and subconsciously controlled. Cut alpha session short and went after these areas with the vibrator. No apparent effect. July 10th. Decided to add yoga exercises to my regimen. Led to try this because a spasm bunches a muscle, while yoga postures stretch it. No apparent results on the first try, but alpha production seems to be progressing. Maintaining above a 50% baseline now. July 14th. Short business trip left no time for alpha training, but did yoga exercises in my hotel room. Felt fine the whole trip. Had good energy. Returned to regimen and found alpha strengthened. Even managed some alpha with eyes open. July 1st. Continued progress. Mind whirling with ideas. Many things seem about to fall into place. Intense significance in everything. July 16th. Deep muscular spasms haven't yielded, but have had an insight concerning them. Armor isn't always designed to prevent danger from coming in. It may also be designed to prevent danger from going out. Example: the lead shield used on nuclear fission devices. July 17th. Becoming convinced that my muscular armoring established to keep my feelings in. Somehow, I must have gotten the idea that they were as dangerous as radiation. Was I that concerned over the safety of others? Or did I think that expressing my feelings was dangerous to myself? July 18th. Great session. Deep muscular spasms seem to be yielding. Some gigantic scale in the far reaches of the universe is gradually moving into balance. July 19th. Hearing my alpha waves, the electrical functioning of my brain, I visualize emanations beamed from some gigantic force field which holds the universe together and contains within itself electricity, gravity, and magnetism. Sensation of I am is very strong. Floating. Mindlessness of Zen. A hidden splendor. July 20th. Rhythm. The alpha rhythm. All is an exchange of energy between two polarities. And at the point of balanced interchange is light. Everything in the universe is a pulse, a cycle, a circle. Layers of complexity removing themselves like the skins from an onion. Underneath, simplicity. July 21st. Control is the wrong word for alpha training. Attunement is the key. Get into the rhythm with the rhythm. The question is, have you got rhythm yet? July 22nd. Heavy rap session with physicist. Weird guy. Thinks there's a soul in matter. Consciousness, that is. Heavy, arrested, and dull to be sure, but consciousness nonetheless. Said he could transmute base metals into gold. Followed him around the party for several hours, hoping for evidence. Only trick he pulled was transmuting alcohol into urine. This he did copiously. July 24th. Took a day off and baked in the sun. Got a slight burn? Couldn't help wondering if sun worship didn't conceal a secret science. Alpha session today was an eye-opener. Gradually achieving some control at lowering frequency and increasing amplitude. At the alpha-theta border, hypnagogic images intrude upon consciousness. On this knife edge may lie the key to creative power, extrasensory perception, and more. And beyond it may lie madness. Did Nietzsche cross over? Those strange notes written from his cell, alternately signed Dionysus and the Crucified. Perhaps he couldn't reconcile the duality. So it engulfed him. July 25th. The vibrator can be set to stimulate the alpha rhythm. Synchronization between the two produces the most extraordinary sensation. July 26th. Unusual sensation of incipient power. Must be careful not to get into this too deeply. One could easily abdicate the world for the mind. Must be similar to the lure of drugs. Looking forward to each of my alpha sessions now. It's the high point of my day. July 27th. Held the alpha-theta border for 20 minutes. Longest time ever. Frightened me a little though. Lost all sense of time and don't know how I came out of it. Had amnesia for all but a fragment of the experience, but carried back into full consciousness a recollection of some hidden splendor. Solitude and alpha training. July 28th. Have no way of knowing whether I can lower brainwave cycles below 8 per second, because at that point I cease hearing the beep and am totally focused on the images in my mind. Decided to enlist an observer. KF seemed just the right person, so brought her in. Dismal failure. Could scarcely produce any alpha at all. Still uptight around people, I guess. July 29th. Good session conducted alone, so decided to have KF back. Some clue here. Perhaps alpha training shouldn't be conducted in the presence of another person, especially one who is in close relationship. July 30th. KF observed session. Did better this time, but not so well as when alone. No doubt this obstacle could be overcome eventually, but offers strong evidence that alpha training is best conducted in solitude. July 31st. Really with it now. 90% baseline alpha with eyes closed, 30% with eyes open. As good as some Zen masters and yogis. August 1st. Dreaming very vividly. Saw Philosopher's Stone last night, brought by the man in the violet jacket. Wish he'd show up when I'm awake. Think our dialogue could get beyond Faust now. August 2nd. Give and take, and the point of balance between. When one overcomes the other, imbalance results, decay and death. With a perfectly balanced interchange is there immortality. Perhaps a structure built on the earth, perfectly balanced between the poles, would never rust, rot, or decay. What shape should it be? A pyramid. Would human beings residing there live forever? August 3rd. Pairs of opposites produce everything. August 4th. Really getting control now. Getting it by letting it. August 5th. Discovered I can immediately switch from alpha to beta and from beta to alpha. Could turn a light switch on and off with my brainwaves now, or send Morse code to a computer and have it type letters, just like an Air Force experiment. August 6th. Growing a bit weary of hooking up each day. Nothing new. August 7th. Held at Alpha Theta Border for full half hour. There are things within the mind that can never be imagined. August 8th. Did all my tricks to be sure I'd mastered them, then packed up the alpha meter. From now on we'll use it only for reinforcement and experiment. Chapter 4. Turning on with alpha waves. Gently tapping his right forefinger against the outside of the small plastic container, He sprinkled a rich tobacco-like substance into cupped cigarette papers held between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand. "You can tell good grass by the smell," he said. "That's what it smells like, see? Like grass." He held the container under my nose. It smelled like grass, all right, like childhood memories of new-mown hay and freshly cut lawns. He put the container aside and finished rolling the cigarette, slender fingers moving expertly. "Grows wild all over the country. In some states, there are thousands of acres of it. Cops burn it, of course. Nothing good can ever be free." He held the cigarette up to the light and studied it. It made a tiny, perfect cylinder. He struck a match and lit it, taking a drag and inhaling deeply, then holding his breath. With smoldering match in one hand and glowing cigarette in the other, with the electrodes of the alpha meter attached to his head, with his eyes widened with the effort of holding his breath, he looked like a man being hit with the first jolt of an electric chair. Grass and alpha. What I wanted to find out was the effect psychedelic drugs had on the production of alpha waves. The widespread use of such drugs in our culture indicated that users were receiving some form of inner relaxation, and the hallucinatory visions reported seemed evidence of brainwave production at the alpha-theta border. If brainwave training could produce the same high without the dangers of drug use, it could prove a real benefit. Bob was my guinea pig. He was an artist who regularly smoked marijuana and occasionally took LSD or mescaline. I first hooked him up to the alpha meter and took a brainwave reading in his normal state, finding that he produced a strong 30% alpha baseline. Now he was smoking a marijuana cigarette. Afterwards, we would take another reading. We sat in Bob's studio above the Sunset Strip. Walls were hung from floor to ceiling with unframed paintings, surrounding us with splashes of color. High-intensity light beamed upon an easel from fluorescent bulbs overhead, illuminating a canvas with sketched horizon and the rest of the landscape languishing in limbo. Music played from a stereo tape deck, and a familiar voice chanted, "The English army had just won the war." A side table was littered with paint rags, multi-hued palettes, crumpled paint tubes, and an abandoned painter's smock. Bob finally emitted an exhalation of light blue smoke with an aroma as exotic as a Turkish coffee house. He grinned. "That's a hit. Now I'm feeling a warm flush between my shoulder blades and a pleasant relaxation in my head. Pretty soon after the next hit, or the next, the warm flush will move up into the back of my head, and I'll feel my whole brain open up. Then power will pour into it from above to meet the energy that has come up from below." He took another drag and stared at me, holding his breath. His eyes were taking on an inner excitement. The pupils were neither expanded nor contracted. Now and again, the alpha sensor gave out a few beeps. Hot, we weren't ready for the test yet. The stereo wailed, "I'd love to TUR and YUON." I felt half turned on already. After the fourth hit, Bob suddenly announced, "There she goes." His eyes focused inwardly. Right up the brainstem, opening up the brain, and now energy pours in from above. He quivered slightly. Then his left eye closed in an exaggerated wink. Wow. That makes all the difference. Just to feel this way, even once in a lifetime, makes everything worthwhile. The color spectrum of light. He put the cigarette out, though it still was not quite finished, and carefully recovered the remaining grains of marijuana, placing them in the plastic tube. "Stuff's getting to be like gold," he muttered. "Mustn't waste it." Then he settled back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Okay, Professor. Let's go." Immediately, the alpha meter began ringing with the continuous beeping of an extraordinarily strong alpha rhythm. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. "Nothing." "How do you feel?" "Floating. Light and airy." "Are you relaxed?" "Not a bone in my body." "Open your eyes." He opened them, and the beeping stopped. But almost immediately it started again, sparser and more subdued, but still very strong. The whites of his eyes were slightly bloodshot. His attention seemed focused far away. Electroencephalographic, he was in a state of samadhi. "Tell me what you're seeing," I urged. "Colors. A kaleidoscope of colors. One follows the other, all the 7 colors of the spectrum. First red, then orange, then yellow, then green, then blue, then indigo, then violet, then back to red, and it starts all over. Everything is in the cycle. Everything is a harmonic of a vibrating frequency. The wheel of color is the play of opposites, an interchange of electrical forces, very mysterious, very magical." He lapsed into silence. "Do you know what you're saying?" I managed. "Not saying. Just seeing." The frequency of the beeping had lowered now, and the amplitude was growing stronger. The alpha-theta border had been reached. "Now what are you seeing?" "Construction of the universe. Made out of light. Everything is a level of consciousness. Lowest level is matter. That's red. Highest level is spirit. That's violet. Then there are levels of levels. Those are octaves, and they get higher and higher. 7 levels of 7 levels." He chuckled, then suddenly sang, "Sweet violet, sweeter than all the roses." He laughed loudly. "A creative miracle." "What level are you on?" I asked. He made a face. "First level. Been here a long time. Can't seem to go beyond. I can see the other levels, though. They're like reflections in a mirror facing a mirror, and the images reflect back and forth, 7 times 7. "Hey," he cried. "I feel like painting." "Wait a minute. Tell me about those levels." But he had already risen to his feet. Now he moved to his easel, trailing wires. "Can't talk about it, Professor. But maybe I can catch it in a painting." He studied the canvas on the easel, pursing his lips. Despite his obvious concentration, bursts of alpha and theta rhythms continued to occur on the alpha meter. Finally, he picked up a brush, daubed it full of blue, and began painting the sky. He moved before the canvas like a boxer before an opponent, on the balls of his feet, lightly and warily. And his lips were pulled back in an expression of elation, as if he knew beyond all doubt that he would finally succeed. I watched as a creative miracle transpired before my eyes, for in 2 hours he completed a masterpiece. Light seemed to originate at some point within the painting itself, and time was there, past, present, and future, and space was a stage for the display of diversity. Though the painting was only a landscape, it seemed impregnated with some profound philosophy. Gradually, over the 2-hour period, Bob's alpha slowly decreased, until at the very end, he was producing no eyes open alpha at all. At that time, he began to adopt a significant procedure. He would stand back from the painting to survey his work. Then he would close his eyes and stand motionless for several seconds. I asked him why he did this, and he answered, "Just to rest my eyes a bit." Each of these eye closures produced strong alpha bursts. When the painting was finished, he sat down beside me, and we studied it together. "It's good," I said. He nodded without vanity. "It's always like that when it's right. Like someone else had painted it." Turning on and tuning in. He rolled another marijuana cigarette. This time I took a drag from it, after first transferring the alpha meter's electrodes from his head to mine. I was surprised how strong the smoke was. It bit sharply at the membranes of my throat and lungs and set me to coughing. Bob grinned. "Always happens the first time. You'll get used to it." "Maybe I won't have to," I answered. "I think I may get the same high just by controlling my brainwaves." "You're kidding." "You mean just by hooking yourself up to that box?" He jerked his thumb at the alpha meter. "That's the way I learned how to do it. But I don't have to hook up anymore, except maybe to test something, like observing the effect on my brainwaves of smoking this joint." Bob studied the box. You think I could train myself to turn on with that thing? Why not? I did. He searched my face. If people could do that, it would save them a bundle and the risk of being busted. How much does the box cost? This one cost $400, but they could be produced to sell for less and be small enough to fit in your pocket. Will you show me how to use it? If you like. He offered the joint again to show his gratitude, and I took several drags. You see, he explained, it's the feeling that everybody's after, that's all. Nobody cares how he gets it. He just wants to feel that he's in tune with things and everything's all right, and that there's a purpose to living. Nothing ever did it for me until I ran into pot and acid. Oh, I boozed it up. But that just got the problem off my mind for an evening and left me with a headache the next day. Grass gives me new insights, and I can work under it. What's more, there's no hangover. On the other hand, acid really takes me on a trip. I get into things so deeply that they seem absolutely real. I can work under acid too, but sometimes the work doesn't hold up. But even then, something good happens. A lot of things come out in the open that were hanging around the fringes of my mind. Some kind of house cleaning takes place, and I usually come up with a new outlook. Acid is hard on me, though, so I don't use it often. The secret of light. I was feeling the effects of the marijuana now. My body was warm and relaxed, my head clear and open. I took another drag and kept my eyes closed while I held my breath. The alpha meter began sounding, and Bob said, "Man, you can really make that thing hum." I was feeling passive volition, that centered willingness to let go that I had struggled so hard to learn while conditioning my alpha. I wondered if I might have come to it easier if I had used marijuana, but there was no way to tell now. Grass was certainly no hindrance in any case. I had never been more productive of alpha. Studying the painting, I felt as if I could enter it, that my consciousness was released to wander in the imaginary landscape. Suddenly, I knew that the illusion of space had been created by the play of opposites, as had time and even light. I could sense some vibrating harmonic somewhere in another realm of consciousness, where an exact duplicate of the landscape on the easel existed in more subtle form, imperceptible to the gross physical eye. But into that enchanted realm the artist had reached with spiritual vision and brought forth the scene on the canvas. How did you manage such a perfect illusion of light? I finally asked. Like this, he answered. He picked up a brush, daubed paint on it, and made 2 quick strokes on the canvas. Light went out of the painting. Depth disappeared. Reality evaporated. 2 brush strokes had reduced the canvas to worthlessness. It was incredible. Now come over here, he said, and I'll show you the secret of light. I peered over his shoulder at his palette. See this color? He asked. He pointed at an olive green, and I nodded. This is the color of the window frame through which we're seeing the landscape. He showed me on the painting. I had a lighter shade of the same color on 2 of the inner edges of that window a moment ago. When I painted them out with the same shade as the other 2 sides, the sunlight disappeared. Do you know what an octave is? In music, but not in painting. Same thing is true with colors as with musical notes. By raising the vibration of the color sufficiently, you eventually cause it to vibrate an exact octave higher. This puts it in harmony with the darker or lower vibrating color. And since it can only be raised to this higher vibration by the addition of white, which is light, when it reaches such harmony, it shows the presence of light. Like this? An appointment with acid. Quickly he added pure white to the olive green, mixing with swift, deft strokes, until he had achieved a light gold color. Then he painted this color on 2 of the inside edges of the window, and the painting came alive with light. I knew where the sun was, even though it was hidden, and its brilliance and its temperature. And depth came into the painting, so that I could see for miles into the canvas. There has to be some law hidden there, I breathed. Something universal. What you've done is godlike. You said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Everything became real. He cleaned his brush and surveyed his work. I felt the same way many times. Sometimes I've even thought I held light in my hand and could unleash it like a thunderbolt to create anything I wanted. Painter's paranoia, I call it. Usually I get it when I've taken acid. It's a godlike feeling, all right. About the highest high possible. When can we experiment with acid? How about a week from today? Okay. I'm sort of disappointed in marijuana. I thought there'd be more to it. He grinned. It's pretty subtle. You may not notice much for a while yet. Then all of a sudden you'll have a thought. Only it won't be a thought. It will be an inward seeing, an experiencing of something in a new way. And you'll wonder why you've never noticed it before. After that, he yawned and stretched and said it was time to hit the sack. And he added that pot usually made him sleepy, but with acid he would be up all night, and maybe the next night too. I packed up my gear, and when I left the studio, he turned out the lights behind me. I couldn't help wondering if the painting on the easel glowed in the dark. So magical had it become in my mind. As I drove home, I had a sense of well-being. It even seemed as if the car were running better than usual, that I was driving exceptionally well, that I had the car under excellent control. But then I noticed that I was driving only 30 miles per hour, considerably under my normal speed, so I knew I had undergone some time and space distortion. That was something I had never noticed when getting high on alpha waves. Alcohol and alpha. I fell asleep with my right forearm resting on the elbow in a balanced position, and I was awakened when it fell to the mattress, which allowed me to recall my dream. The man in the violet jacket had been straddling the earth with his feet in the seas and his head towering into space, and he had been announcing in a stentorian voice, "Let there be light." Vainly, I tried to recapture the details of this dream, but my only recollection was of journeying endlessly through the spectrum of colors. During the ensuing week, I could almost believe I had become a dope fiend as I continued my experiments. Though I was resolved to conduct my grass and acid experiments on Bob, since increased alpha in myself might not be noticeable due to my already strong alpha patterns. Other experiments, such as with alcohol, barbiturates, and amphetamines, could be conducted on myself, since these drugs were nowhere accorded the hallucinogenic properties, which were the prime indicator of brainwave frequency in the alpha-theta region. Though I didn't know what effect barbiturates, opiates, and stimulants would have on alpha production, I was fairly certain they would not increase it. I started my experiments by buying and drinking a pint of Scotch whiskey. The first noticeable effect was that the Scotch didn't taste as good as I remembered, nor did my stomach greet its arrival with the customary appreciation. I wondered if I had lost my taste for it, and if so, whether my increased alpha might not be responsible. The literature on marijuana repeatedly stated that users lost their desire for alcoholic beverages, and since I had already seen how marijuana increased Bob's alpha, I was about ready to conclude that alpha production was antagonistic to alcohol. Such a conclusion, at least in my own case, proved to be true. At first, I experienced a small increase in alpha as the alcohol was converted to glucose in my bloodstream, and I experienced a sense of relaxation and euphoria. But then, as I began to exhibit the first signs of drunkenness, blurring of vision and awkward balance, it became increasingly more difficult to produce alpha, even in the eyes closed position. There was a definite slowing of my beta rhythm into the 16-18 cycle per second range, but this rhythm seemed erratic, as if something fundamental to its symmetry had been withdrawn. Finally, as I began to get toward the bottom of the bottle and was having difficulty navigating, I could produce no alpha whatever. However, for the first time, I heard my own delta. A few bursts in the 1-4 cycles per second range are all I remember, however, for I had great difficulty staying awake. Sometime later, I fell asleep in the chair, electrodes still pasted to my head. Amphetamines and alpha. When the maid came into the apartment in the morning, her scream awakened me. She said afterwards that she thought I'd electrocuted myself. That scream set off a headache that lasted 8 hours, and even aspirin afforded no relief. As I switched from alcohol to pills, I couldn't help reflecting on the vicious circle most Americans found themselves trapped in, uptight and seeking relaxation in booze, only to wind up with a hangover and forced to take pills for surcease. No wonder that hospitals and mental institutions were overflowing. Toward the end of the day, when the hangover still showed no signs of alleviating, I decided to try an alpha treatment. I hooked myself up to the meter because I felt sure that the pain in my head would prevent my turning on alpha without some guideline. It was fortunate that I did, for turning on alpha proved to be difficult indeed. Right off, I produced a low-amplitude, high-frequency beta rhythm, and my efforts to slow it into alpha were at first fruitless. My head seemed gripped in a vice as its musculature contracted in spasm. Gradually, however, I was able to let go. Before long, alpha began appearing in my brainwave pattern. When finally I was able to let go altogether, the pain in my head disappeared. I kept up the session for a half-hour longer, emerging highly elated. Not only had I cured my hangover, but I had replaced lassitude with energy, pain with pleasure, and dullness with excitement. It seemed to me that probably all headaches were caused by spasms in the vascular system, and that this restriction of blood to the brain prevented the occurrence of alpha. Relaxing such spasms could bring an end to headaches, but only when one learned the trick of passive volition. Next day, I dosed myself with amphetamines and got as charged up as a whirling dervish. My problem was to sit still long enough to get a reading from the alpha meter, because what I really wanted was plenty of action. It was easy to see how speed freaks became addicted and to understand how speed kills. My body was so revved up that I thought it would never slow down, and my mind seemed to work like lightning. I had an overpowering sense of megalomania, as if I could do anything. Quite suddenly, I had become psychotic and was experiencing firsthand what it felt like to be Napoleon, Hitler, or even Satan. I couldn't help thinking of that secret formula by which the law-abiding Dr. Jekyll had transformed himself into the criminal Mr. Hyde, for I found myself scurrying about the apartment with a kind of monstrous energy, and had to exert the utmost will to prevent myself from going out in the streets, where I would have been almost certain to provoke a disturbance. I finally managed to get myself hooked up to the alpha meter, but try as I might, I could produce no alpha. All that could be picked up was a high-frequency beta, so fast that the beeping was reduced to a continuous tone. My vaunted alpha control had completely disappeared. Eventually, fearing that further fruitless attempts might destroy the conditioning I had already achieved, I disconnected the meter and abandoned further attempts. To work off the energy that gouged at me, I drove to the beach and joined a furious volleyball game. Afterwards, I swam in the ocean for 2 hours. Even this activity failed to tire me, and when I finally went to bed at 2 in the morning, it was to spend a sleepless night. Thinking of the thousands of people taking amphetamines for weight reduction, I couldn't help wondering if much of the attention on drug abuse wasn't focused in the wrong area. Barbiturates and alpha. I needed 3 days to recover from this experience, but when I did, I was ready to test barbiturates. What fell into my hands were pills known as red birds, a compound consisting primarily of phenobarbital, the basic ingredient of most sleeping tablets. I'd been cautioned that one of these goofballs would be plenty, so that's what I took. Then I hooked up to the alpha meter and waited for results. They weren't long coming. Soon I became so sleepy I could barely keep my eyes open. When I closed them, the meter began picking up slow delta rhythms with occasional bursts of theta, but no alpha whatever. I tried to correlate the theta bursts with mental imagery, but my thought processes were so disrupted that it was difficult for me to keep track of anything. I felt wiped out, completely out of it. It was hard to imagine anyone taking barbiturates for kicks. Apparently, through sheer willpower, I carried my experiment to a conclusion, but I have no recollection of it. My notes, almost indecipherable, tell of the struggle. The main thing that I sought to learn, the effect of barbiturates on alpha production, seems abundantly clear. 8:07 p.m. Downer taking effect. Feeling groggy. Attempt at producing alpha with eyes closed proved erratic. some production of low-amplitude waves, rapidly losing control. 8:22 p.m. Very sleepy now. Beta rhythm practically disappeared. Delta rhythm predominating, with occasional theta. Trying to correlate theta to mental imagery. Hard to think. Mind moving very slowly. 8:43 p.m. Feel like a sleepy vegetable. Do vegetables get sleepy? Rather be a carrot than a turnip. Better still an onion. Better yet a clove of garlic. Best of all a radish. Slipping. Wonder how long I can stay awake. 9:03 p.m. Barely holding on now. Only delta rhythm. Basic pulse upon which everything is built. Must originate on some far-off island in space and activate the whole universe. Writing now almost illegible. Synchronize. Investigate. There were a few other notations that were completely indecipherable. I found the philosophical content of the final entry particularly intriguing, especially after the foolishness of the third entry. This seemed to indicate that there was much to be learned from the study of the subconscious. By now I was equating delta rhythms with the subconscious and beta rhythms with the conscious and the alpha-theta border as the balance between. Certain patterns were beginning to emerge, giving me glimpses of some grand design. It left me with a feeling of excitement, as if I were on the verge of a discovery. Acid and alpha. By the time the weekend rolled around bringing my acid trip appointment with Bob, I was in rare good humor, and this good humor was mostly attributable to my new reaction to drugs. Not that I had overcome my prejudice against them, but where before I had failed to find any redeeming feature, now I began to see that drugs could be a gateway to the study of the mind, for they could slow brain rhythms, speed them up, and even balance them. Brainwave control could do all these things more cheaply and with less risk. But now I saw that much of the drive to use drugs was not based merely on a desire to escape or to experience new kicks, but to actually learn more about the self and the mind and the brain and imagination and creativity and spiritual realization. Seeing myself possessor of a method of achieving these results, with none of the hazards of drug use, I was pleased. Bob had company when I arrived, and I was introduced to a lovely young lady whom he described as a talented painter and designer. She had black eyes and hair and a classical Roman cast to her features. Her name was Kay. They were discussing marketing some jewelry which she had recently designed, and she held up various pieces to illustrate. Since most of them were cast in signs of the zodiac, I asked if she believed in astrology. She answered that she had made a lifelong study of it, and felt that it answered more about the behavior of people than psychoanalysis, to which she had been subjected for 2 years. Astrology was devised before Copernicus, I said, when men still thought the sun revolved around the earth. She studied me. You're a Virgo with Leo rising. A lovely new subject. I was startled. I knew I had been born under the sign of Virgo, but since I had never had a horoscope drawn, I did not know my rising sign. I told her as much, and she asked for the date and hour and place of my birth. These I gave her. I'll work it out for you, she stated. We'll see where your planets are. But I'm willing to bet that you have Leo rising. Overthoughtful and overly independent, doesn't that describe you? I had to admit that it did. But I was far from sure that astrology had served her. More likely, it was a shrewd appraisal. She's going to take acid too, announced Bob. We've been planning a session but have never made it yet. Are you going to drop with us? I said that I planned to, but would take it at least an hour after they did, just to be sure that I wasn't high when measuring their reactions. With that, Bob passed out tiny purple pills. He swallowed his with a gulp of water, and Kay followed suit. I placed mine in my pocket. Takes at least 40 minutes before there's a reaction, said Bob. I've got some finishing touches to put on this canvas, so if you'll excuse me, I'll get to work. Does Kay know about my alpha meter? I asked him. He said that she did. I turned to her. Maybe I could do your head before the acid takes effect. That would give me something to compare results with. She smiled and said that she'd be glad to try it, because Bob had told her that you could turn on by learning to control your brainwaves, and you didn't need acid or pot or anything. I said I wasn't completely sure yet, but it looked like it. We decided to go downstairs so as not to disturb Bob at his work. We found a place in the study, a large room with bookcases, a desk, and several comfortable chairs. From above, we could hear the stereo hi-fi as Bob turned the music up, and I closed the study door. As I wired Kay to the alpha meter, she let me know that she had a friend who was interning at the UCLA hospital and who intended to specialize in neurology, and that she'd heard him mention brainwaves several times. When I finally got her hooked up and the alpha meter tuned, she immediately began producing a strong alpha baseline. A brush with astrology. I couldn't help making a correlation between her and Bob. Both artists, both highly creative, both producing good alpha. In addition, they were attractive people. Slim, lithe, energetic. I had to admit a tinge of envy as I recalled my own hard struggle to gain alpha control, while these two, right off the bat, were farther ahead than I had been after a month of training. Putting my wounded vanity aside, I got on with the business of instructing Kay in feedback training. Then I found a seat beside her and watched. I allowed her to experiment in this manner for 5 minutes, enough to satisfy her curiosity, but not enough to give her any control, for I didn't want to interfere with the test I was about to make. When I turned off the device, she expressed regret, for she said she was getting the feeling of what an alpha high meant, and it was a great deal different than a drug high. Clearer, more natural, as if regaining some lost way of seeing. I thought that described it very well and told her so, and she said she wanted to do my horoscope immediately. With that, she drew a book from her handbag and began thumbing through it, now and again pausing to jot down a notation. It was cozy in the study. The many books, the filtered light, the attractive young lady, the thought that I might be on the verge of some breakthrough, all combined to give me a pleasant, relaxed feeling. When I looked at my wristwatch, I saw that a half hour had passed since Bob and Kay had taken the acid, and I turned on the alpha meter and began to observe her closely for effects. As she concentrated on her work, the meter gave out the rapid sounds of beta, a natural response to concentration. Several times she emitted little gasps and stared at me, so I gathered she was running into something unusual. When she finally finished, she studied her work a last time, and then announced, "You have Mercury in Leo, Mars in Leo, Saturn in Leo, Neptune in Leo, and just as I thought, you have Leo rising. These are all leadership signs." "Tell that to the Navy," I commented. "Your leadership signs are in science, business, philosophy, and mysticism, a highly unusual, almost conflicting combination. Can your work resolve these?" "I hope so." A creative key. Your Venus is in Libra, which means that your sex drive is gentle and easily repressed, she laughed. Your Jupiter is in Gemini, which means that you see both sides of things. And your Uranus is in Aquarius, which means that you bring secrets into the open. Surely there must be some negative aspects. She studied her diagrams. Your worst fault could be an asset. Both your Sun and your Moon are in Virgo, and there isn't a single water sign in your entire horoscope. This means that you are highly rational and disinclined to accept anything as fact that cannot be scientifically proven. That could make you a source of irritation to your more intuitive friends, especially those who are believers and accept things on faith. In addition, you often enjoy argument for argument's sake. That's Mars in Leo, you see. And some people might find you a trifle belligerent. Then, too, you find it difficult to accept a subordinate role. You must either be the leader or operate on your own. This has made you something of a lone wolf. You couldn't be more accurate if you'd known me for 20 years, I admitted. Though these traits can be faults, they can also work for you, she answered. You see, the energy of Leo and the rationality of Virgo and the lack of water signs mean that you can journey as deeply as you like into the world of fantasy, without danger of believing that your fantasies are real. In short, you can really let your imagination go without losing contact with the real world. You could never freak out on acid, for example. You would always know that the images were only in your head. Believe me, she emphasized, there is great creative power in such a position. I couldn't help but be impressed. To tell you the truth, I never believed there was much to astrology. But you've really won me over. Are you sure you haven't picked up most of this from Bob? An introduction to the devil. She grinned. There goes your Virgo rationality. No, Bob hasn't told me a thing. Except that you have a machine that can teach people how to turn on with brainwaves. I'm a Cancer, you see, and my horoscope is full of water signs. You and I will always be a bit of a mystery to each other. But then, that's what makes the world go around. Oh dear, she suddenly exclaimed. I think I'm feeling the acid. She pointed to her abdomen. It always hits me in the solar plexus first. I get a feeling of excitement right here. She placed her palm below her breasts. Her eyes were beginning to shine, and her inner excitement was obvious. I asked her to close her eyes, and the ensuing beeping showed increased alpha. But I preferred to get my principal reading when the session was farther along. So I asked her to reopen her eyes and tell me something about herself. She said that she was an old soul who had been incarnated many times, and that she once had been Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, and had been entrusted with the secret teachings of the Egyptian priesthood, those rites conducted within the Great Pyramid of Giza, and upon which the entire Mediterranean civilization had been based. But she said that she had misused the trust placed in her, choosing to gratify her own desires rather than enlighten her people, and now she had to live through the karma caused by that act, a very difficult karma, because that act had caused abandonment of the feminine principle of mystery and its replacement by the masculine principle of authority. Now the age of the masculine principle of authority was ending too, and there would soon be a return to feminine mystery. Then the secret teachings of Cleopatra would rise again to seize the imaginations and the motivations of men, and to launch a new age of peace and prosperity. All this sounded quite fantastic, and I had in mind that it was the acid talking and not Kay, but it was interesting enough, and I didn't shrug it off entirely, because after all she had made astrology seem real, and if she could do that, maybe I shouldn't turn my back on reincarnation either. By this time, over an hour had passed since she had taken the acid, so I ran a full-scale test of her brainwaves. With eyes closed, she was producing a 90% alpha baseline, with frequencies mostly in the alpha-theta region and interspersed with long trains of theta. With eyes open, she was producing nearly a 50% alpha baseline, as well as getting a noticeable amount of theta. Clearly, she was in an unusual state. When I disconnected her from the alpha meter, she found a mirror and began making faces in front of it. I am the devil, she announced. Did you know that the devil is a woman? She whirled on me with teeth bared and head thrown back, as if to mesmerize me on spot. The Trinity in duality. It was an idea that had never occurred to me before, but I considered it carefully. If God were masculine, the devil should be feminine, for there were only two forces at work in the universe, and by their interaction, all things were created. As she stood there, so perfectly posed as a female devil, it seemed to me that there was something classic in her stance, and I visualized a masculine god in the sky on the right, and a female devil in the sky on the left, and down below, upon the earth, man between, the creation of the eternal forces of masculine and feminine. You see, exclaimed Kay triumphantly. You know that it's true? I withdrew the purple pill then and placed it in my mouth, washing it down with saliva. I had no idea what was about to happen, but I was sufficiently intrigued by what was going on in Kay's mind to look forward to similar events in mine. Add an O to God, and you get good, she intoned. Subtract a D from the devil, and you get evil. Good works in the light. Evil works in the dark. Woman is the fallen angel, you see. Lucifer is female. By her creation out of light, life ensued and will continue until all mysteries are solved. Then everything will once again be light. That was pretty heavy stuff. Indeed, she might have been Cleopatra presiding over some secret rite in a chamber of the pyramid, for the manner in which she stood there and pronounced the words. But this is only her trip, I thought. It's just a story that she lays on herself to give her life meaning and significance. Yet, somehow, I was unconvinced. The duality and the resolution of the duality which she so graphically described made a deep impression on me. Now I saw this conflict and resolution, stretching back into the beginning of time, casting up all forms, creating all philosophies, making all works of art, all governments and religions, all wars, diplomacies and dynasties. I sensed that at my fingertips lay a simple truth, a truth so profound that once I understood it, I would comprehend all knowledge. An illustration of thought transference. There was a clatter of footsteps on the stairs, and the door burst open. Bob stood there, clutching a canvas in one hand and waving the other excitedly. "I finished a painting in an hour," he cried. "It just seemed to leap off the brush onto the canvas. I have no idea where it came from or even what it means, because I never saw a landscape like it before." He held it up to our view, excited eyes showing the effects of LSD. In the background of a golden landscape, a series of pyramids were silhouetted against the sky. Before them, marked by crosses and tombstones, was a giant cemetery. In the immediate foreground lay a large rock. Something like human hair grew from the rock, and now I could see a face hidden there, peering out from the darkness, a feminine face, queen-like, watching and waiting. From this head extended a rope, snake-like over the sand, entwining around a giant needle and climbing to the top to penetrate the eye. I could feel my hair stand on end. That's Cleopatra's needle, I thought. And that's her in the rock, waiting. And beyond, in the graveyard before the pyramids, all her knowledge is buried. And soon somebody will pull the rope through the needle and hoist her on high to rule once again. Bob had painted this picture in his studio above, even as Kay had been discussing Cleopatra in the study below. It was a graphic illustration of thought transference. Chapter 5. Space and Time Unveiled. I had expected mind-blowing hallucinations from LSD, or at least some far-out visual effects. But all that happened was that I felt stimulated and had a sensation of drawing in on myself. This drawn-in feeling was physically manifest by my unconsciously pulling in my stomach. I could feel a tautness in my muscles too, though it wasn't an uptight sensation, but more an overabundance of energy. For a while, I thought that the acid had failed to affect me at all, but when I looked in the mirror, my eyes shone like polished agates, and my face was unusually pale. Here and there on the surface of the skin were faintly perceptible blotches. I'd seen myself in this condition before. It was immediately following a night-long naval battle off the Philippine coast during World War II, and my system had been full of adrenaline. Dimensions of the mind. Adrenaline and I were old friends. We'd played football together, fought the war together, and taken plenty of financial risks together. Never once had adrenaline betrayed me. But I knew lots of people who adrenaline had destroyed. Adrenaline simply turned to adrenoxin or adrenochrome in their bloodstreams, and since these substances were toxic and affected the brain in such a manner that things could be seen that weren't there, and things could be heard that weren't said, such persons were regarded as schizophrenics. As I peered at myself in the mirror, I couldn't help wondering if the much-vaunted hallucinatory drug, LSD, was after all only a stimulant of the adrenal glands, and people who couldn't handle adrenaline were thrown into temporary schizophrenia. But then I remembered the high alpha readings I had gotten from Kay, and the startling example of thought transference between her and Bob, so I knew there was more to it. The problem was that LSD was a strain on the body, and if you couldn't handle that strain, you went temporarily crazy. But adrenaline was friendly with Kay and Bob too, so we had a good trip. Yet it was a far cry from anything I'd expected. Bob went back to his easel and continued painting. Kay pulled out some wax and a Bunsen burner and began making molds for jewelry. And I cloistered myself in the study with pencil and paper and began jotting down notes on space and time, the source of the 10,000 things. Somebody looking in the window at the three of us at work would have difficulty believing we were all on dope. Now and again, we gathered in the kitchen for coffee and shared our problems and insights. But for the most part, each of us was content with solitary exploration of his inner world. I departed at dawn, leaving behind the alpha meter so Bob and Kay could train their own brainwaves. Then I drove up into the Hollywood Hills and watched the sun rise over the Sierra Madre Mountains and cast its first rays on the city. Later, I motored to the beach and spent the day on the sand. Sometime in the afternoon, I fell asleep by the ocean and didn't awaken until nightfall. I felt tired and drained, so I went home and to bed. As it turned out, it was the last acid trip for Kay and Bob. Using the alpha meter, both were able to condition their alpha waves. Kay gave up marijuana too, finding the alpha high more satisfying. But Bob continued to smoke grass occasionally, explaining that it allowed him to get into his work more deeply. Gate to the root of the world. Meanwhile, my beginning flirtation with space and time had blossomed into a romance, and this love affair could be traced to my increased understanding of brainwaves. The polarities that seemed to exist between the various brainwaves had become a source of deep fascination. For example, two of the brainwaves, the delta and theta rhythms, could be identified with the subconscious mind as exemplified by the autonomic nervous system, while the other two brainwaves, alpha and beta, could be identified with the conscious mind as exemplified by the central nervous system. Within the autonomic nervous system, the delta rhythm seemed synonymous with the parasympathetic division, while the theta rhythm seemed synonymous with the sympathetic division. Within the central nervous system, the alpha rhythm seemed representative of the afferent or receptor nerves, while the beta rhythm seemed representative of the efferent or motor nerves. These groupings appeared to be neatly divided into stimulus response patterns. On the unconscious level, delta seemed to indicate reception of the stimulus, while theta seemed to indicate response to the stimulus. On the conscious level, alpha appeared to represent reception of the stimulus, while beta appeared to represent response to the stimulus. These polarities themselves seemed to be contained with the larger polarities of conscious and unconscious minds, the unconscious governing reception of stimuli and the conscious governing response. With a little speculation, this structure of polarities within polarities could be carried even further, for a universal mind might govern all stimuli, while the individual mind might govern all response. For the first time, I glimpsed a resolution of the apparent contradiction between free will and predestination, and there welled up in me the feeling that there was some profound but simple truth. I recalled the words of Lao Tzu. These two come paired but distinct by their names. Of all things profound, say that their pairing is deepest, the gate to the root of the world. Dynamics of ecology. The philosophical system thus described is based on dualism and the resolution of that dualism. For the most part, literature concerning it has disappeared, and little is known except Lao Tzu's tiny book of 25 pages called The Tao, in which the two forces are referred to as yin and yang. The emblem of the system has been left us, and consists of black and red teardrop shapes, combined in such fashion as to make a half-red and half-black circle, known as a syzygy, meaning the putting together of opposites. Since in deepest essence, yang represents the male force of light, heat, and activity, while yin represents the female force of darkness, coldness, and passivity. Any study of the methods by which these two forces combine is naturally tinged with eroticism. There may be difficulties with this conception, since popular usage associates eroticism almost exclusively with human sexual arousal. But this shallow interpretation surely will yield in the face of overwhelming evidence that male and female polarities conceal a key to life's mysteries. The dancing, playful flow of life is sexual. Forms merging, spinning together, reproducing eros in countless manifestations. All living organisms are throbbing together in a billion-year-old electric sexual dance. Inanimate matter too consists of multitudinous combinations of two fundamental polarities, and there seems to be nothing under the sun, or even beyond the sun, that does not follow this basic law. The creative power of the universe is thus made manifest as a dynamic point of balance. Therefore, I propose to define this particular philosophy as ecology. While the symmetrical polarities of brain rhythms turned me onto this line of reasoning, what launched me on a full-scale quest was the sudden awareness that the structure of the atom appeared to be identical with the structure of the solar system. In each case, there was a sun, proton, around which planets' electrons revolved, and the centripetal
Naloxone reverses an opioid overdose, even if you mispronounce it. For the record, it's naloxone. Na, like, is naloxone addictive? Nuh-uh. Lox, like naloxone keeps humans safe like locks keep bikes safe, and own, like naloxone can save lives in our very own communities. So let's head down to the pharmacy and pick up some over-the-counter naloxone. And if you forget the name, ask for the nasal spray that reverses overdoses. They'll know what you mean. Get informed at factsfightfentanyl.org, sponsored by the California Department of Public Health.
force, gravity of the sun, balance the centrifugal force, velocity of the planets, creating a structure held together by vast electromagnetic forces. For example, forcing an electron out of or into the tiny atomic system unleashes the awesome power of the fission and fusion bombs. It was to this point that my mind had taken the problem when I underwent the acid trip with Bob and Kay, and the hours spent making notes in Bob's study now proved most fruitful. Those notes follow as originally transcribed. Notes on space and time. 1. Space and time are both antagonistic and complementary, like night and day, woman and man, winter and summer. They combine to create and destroy everything that exists in the universe. 2. Space and time are always limited and always relative. Nothing exists that is altogether space or altogether time. Each thing is either more space than time or more time than space. 3. All things follow a cycle, a pulse beat, a sine wave. Therefore, space changes into time, and time changes into space. 4. Centripetal time is constrictive. It produces heat, density, heaviness, sound, and the tendency to go downward. Centrifugal space is expansive. It produces cold, dilation, lightness, silence, and the tendency to go upward. 5. Whatever contains more water than solids is space. Whatever contains more solids than water is time. 6. A broad form represents time. A tall form represents space. 7. The 7 colors of the spectrum range from time, red, to space. Violet. 8. Beauty is the proper proportion of time to space. Love, too, is the proper proportion of space to time. What is the proper proportion? It is that proportion which leads to the balanced interchange of energy between polarities. Aesthetics holds it to be the divine proportion. 9. A man is time, centripetal, strong, active. When to time he is violent, cruel, and destructive. A woman is space, centrifugal, yielding, and passive. When to space she is lethargic, weak, and escapist. 10. Men and women are antagonistic and complementary. Their fate is to play tag forever. That is what makes life so interesting, amusing, and dramatic. 11. Time is alkaline. Space is acid. Preparing the uterine tract with an alkaline may result in the conception of male children, while preparing it with an acid may result in the conception of female children. 12. Foods that grow above the ground are more space than time, while those that grow below the ground are more time than space. An insight into immortality. 13. Nowhere are the forces of space and time better illustrated than in the pulse beat of life itself, in the expansion and contraction of the living heart. Systolic is time. Diastolic is space. Systolic pressure is created when the heart contracts, pumping blood through the arteries. The flow of this blood through the arteries is space, since it is expansive, thus illustrating how time creates space. Diastolic pressure is created when the heart expands, sucking blood back through the veins. The flow of this blood through the veins is time, since it is moving toward the center, thus illustrating how space creates time. Moreover, the space flow of blood through the arteries is colored time, red, while the time flow of blood back through the veins is colored space, blue. People with high blood pressure are to time. People with low blood pressure are to space. These conditions probably are correctable by the appropriate eating of space or time foods to offset the imbalanced condition. 14. The balanced interchange of energy between time and space always creates something other than time or space. The time proton and the space electron create the balanced structure of the atom. The time sun and the space planets create the balanced structure of the solar system. The time positive pole and the space negative pole create the balanced power of alternating electrical current. The time male and the space female create the balanced structure of the family. Time oxygen and space hydrogen create the water which results in life. 15. Time gives or sends. Space receives or takes. Once space has received extra energy, it then turns into time and sends that energy. And once time has sent energy, it then turns into space and receives energy. This pulsation, this balanced shifting of polarities, this pulsing alternation of giving and receiving, keeps all structures intact and makes them relatively immortal. When imbalance creeps into the system, however, and one polarity continues to take while the other continues to give, then decay sets in and the mortality and eventual demise of the system are established. Not irreversible, said the man in the violet jacket. Is this what he meant? Now as I examined the diagram which represented the simple workings of ecology, for the first time I realized that there had been a profound change in the way my mind worked. The many diversities of life had suddenly, it seemed, arranged themselves in such a fashion as to be easily dealt with and quickly understood. I couldn't help feeling that I was now much wiser than I had been only a few months before. I saw that excessive time in the human being produced sadism, while excessive space produced masochism, and that social institutions were as prone to such imbalanced conditions as individuals. For the first time, I began to understand that love was a power resulting from the balanced interchange of energy between individuals, and that any imbalance in this interchange could only produce exaggerated cruelty or dependent suffering. Seeing this, it seemed to me that understanding the principles of ecology should increase man's ability to cope with his environment and his fellows, and such increased ability should be evidenced by a higher intelligence quotient. Measuring the intelligence quotient. For years, it had been assumed that one's IQ was something he was born with, that it was mostly a matter of the genetic structure of the original 23 chromosomes that made up the embryonic human being, that if a person had an IQ of 100 when he was 10 years old, that's the same IQ he would have when he was 20 or 30 or 40. However, nearly all testers agreed that a grasp of the tools of thought, such as language, arithmetic, and basic mechanics, was necessary before a person's intelligence could be tested. Now I had stumbled across a new tool for thought, one that could break down every problem into two basic components and find the point of balance where the solution lay. The possession of such knowledge should provide a substantial rise in an individual's IQ. I had taken several intelligence tests over the years, and the highest score which the testers had given me was 124 on the cattle scale. Now I wanted to take another test to see if my alpha conditioning and recent insights had brought about a verifiable increase in intelligence. While I shopped around for a place to take a supervised test, I ran into a man who said he was a member of Mensa, a high IQ club which restricted membership to those who could score in the upper 2% of the population on a supervised intelligence test. I inquired as to what that score might be and was told at least 147. I sent in my application and in a few days received notification of my testing date. As it happened, the test was to be administered at my old stomping ground, the medical center of Uell, and the date was 3 weeks in the future. Meanwhile, I became involved with Kundalini Yoga, a synthesis of yoga. I had been doing yoga postures for some weeks now, and the sense of well-being that followed these exercises prompted me to look into the discipline further. Much of my early writing and research had been inspired by the works of Sri Aurobindo, and among his books was one entitled The Synthesis of Yoga, in which he extracted from the numerous yoga disciplines that which he considered to be the heart of the training. Yoga, stated Aurobindo, is a turning of the human soul from the egoistic state of consciousness absorbed in outward appearances and attractions of things to a higher state in which the transcendent and universal can pour itself into the individual mold and transform it. When the human ego realizes that its will is a tool, its wisdom ignorance and childishness, its power an infant's groping, its virtue a pretentious impurity, and learns to trust itself to that which transcends it, that is its salvation. This is the decisive movement, the turning of the ego to that which is infinitely greater than itself, its self-giving and indispensable surrender. I had read this passage many times, but now it suddenly awakened new reverberations. The word surrender did it. Now I saw that it was synonymous with the passive volition necessary for the production of alpha brain rhythms. The polarities of space and time had provided new insight into the mind, and I perceived that the way into the unconscious and loss of ego lay through passivity and surrender, while the way to greater self-consciousness and larger ego lay in the exercise of active volition or willpower. Suddenly the eternal duality of God and the devil flashed before my eyes, and I saw that God, ruler of the subconscious, required subordination and passivity, while the devil, ruler of the conscious, required the exercise of will, and I knew that the man in the violet jacket, on the ocean pier in the darkness, real or unreal, had been the point of balanced interchange between these eternal opposites, and so had confronted me with the Faustian bargain. It was as if my consciousness suddenly leapt over the centuries, and I sat down in the presence of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, he in wig and greatcoat and moving a quilled pen over foolscap, its scratching the only sound in the silence of the house. And I said, one need not sell his soul to the devil, for neither the will nor the imagination rules, but rather a balance between. And Goethe smiled, though he did not look up, for my statement was only a thought in his mind. The alpha champ, who was a failure. Now polarities were clearly drawn. There was mysticism, which sought the answer to man's condition by surrender to the forces of the unconscious, and there was magic, which sought the answer to man's condition by the exercise of willpower. Carried to extremes, the mystic was reduced to worldly ineffectiveness, while the magician destroyed himself by opposing universal law. It often happens that when we are prepared to see something that we find it transpiring under our noses. So it was that a recent acquaintance, having heard of my alpha meter, called me and asked for a training session because he was convinced that alpha production was the gateway to the development of psychic powers. Over the years, he had been involved in just about every psychic activity on the face of the earth, and he didn't intend to miss this new opportunity. When he showed up for the first session, and I hooked him up to the alpha meter, he began producing a 100% alpha baseline. He could even produce alpha with his eyes open. I couldn't believe it. I sat there with my mouth open and gaped, because here, right before my eyes, was a man who had achieved the ultimate. He could produce alpha with the best of them. But his life was a mess. He couldn't make money, couldn't hold a job, couldn't sustain a relationship, was overweight, hypochondriacal, and totally impractical. Yet he was a champion at producing alpha. As I sat there and stared at him, it finally dawned on me that I had fallen victim to the very trap that I sought to extricate myself from. Simply because I myself had been hung up in the conscious world of logic and willpower, and had been greatly benefited by learning to mesh this world with the subconscious world of passivity and imagination, I had assumed that everyone else suffered from the same malady, and that the cure for all ailments was learning how to produce alpha. Now I saw that it was possible for a person to become imbalanced in the opposite direction, by producing too much alpha, by becoming too passive, by coming to believe that the world of the imagination was the only reality. To test my theory, I asked my friend to try producing beta. He couldn't produce a lick. Mysticism and magic. During the next 2 hours, I learned that it is even more difficult for a person who is too passive to become more aggressive than it is for a person who is too aggressive to become more passive, for once a person has built a habit pattern of passivity, it requires aggressiveness to change it, and since he cannot find this aggressiveness within himself, He must depend on someone else to change the pattern for him. On the other hand, the person who is too aggressive is at least able to muster the action energy needed to change some of his aggression to passivity. To further complicate matters, few counselors knew how to turn passivity to aggressiveness, and even fewer had the courage to do so. In the case of my friend, I simply disconnected him from the alpha meter and told him that he was a miserable failure because he was more female than male and would never amount to anything because he let everybody push him around, and I didn't have any time to waste on people who had no spunk, so it would please me if he just left. He left all right, but when he did, he was showing plenty of aggressiveness. Now I had to resolve the conflict between mysticism and magic. Sri Aurobindo's yoga was too passive for this purpose. Was there another yoga that combined aggressiveness with passivity in such a fashion as to achieve both serenity and power? There was indeed. It was Kundalini Yoga. The theory behind this ancient discipline was that of serpent power, the fire of Kundalini, goddess of nature, which lay coiled up at the base of the spine, and which by exercise, meditation, and concentration could be moved up through the 7 ganglionic centers of the body, known as chakras, until it entered the pineal gland at the top of the head, and there merged with divine power, solar energy. 2 forces, one emerging from the earth, the other emerging from the sun, and in their balanced interchange lay both peace and power. Kundalini Yoga, it seemed to me, provided a mental and physical discipline which applied the principles of space and time and the balanced interchange of the energies of ecology. Here, then, was a discipline aimed at achieving balance between the will and the imagination, a discipline which sought the point of equilibrium between the subconscious and conscious minds indicated in brainwave technology by activity at the alpha-theta border. Here, it seemed, was the point of innovation, the place of greater awareness, the region of increased power. With a firm anchor here, one could move as deeply into the imagination as he liked, or absorb himself in the material world as much as he liked, and always return to balance. Seeing this, I began the practice of Kundalini Yoga. The yoga of ecology. What struck me at once was that the 7 chakras, ganglionic centers, corresponded to the 7 colors of the spectrum, and since the ascent of consciousness through the 7 colors led to revelation of the ultimate, I couldn't help thinking that the legendary pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, the 7 colors of the spectrum, was really not at the end of the rainbow, but rather across it. The 7 chakras were arranged in the following order. PL. 1. The seat of Kundalini in the coccyx, the lowest vertebra of the spine. 2. The sexual organs. 3. The adrenal glands behind the navel. 4. The heart. 5. The thyroid gland in the throat. 6. The pituitary gland behind the forehead. 7. The seat of Vishnu, the sun, in the pineal gland below the top of the skull. Colors corresponding to the various chakras were as follows. 1. Red for the coccyx. 2. Orange for the gonads. 3. Yellow for the adrenals. 4. Green for the heart. 5. Blue for the thyroid. 6. Indigo for the pituitary. 7. Violet for the pineal. The 7 notes of the musical scale also correspond to the various chakras, beginning with note F in the key of C for the coccyx, and continuing up to the note E for the pineal gland. Certain vowel sounds also corresponded to the chakras, and these were as follows. 1. I for the coccyx. 2. For the gonads. 3. A for the adrenals. 4. For the heart. 5. O for the thyroid. 6. O for the pituitary. 7. And E for the pineal. Chanting these vowels together with masculine or feminine consonants could provide selected stimulation for any of the chakras. Masculine consonants of action and aggression were those that were hard or growling, such as D, K, and R, while feminine consonants of serenity and passivity were those that were soft or yielding, such as M, N, and Y. According to Kundalini Yoga, the spine with its 33 segments, including the uppermost vertebra, the skull, is the carrier of life. At the top of the uppermost vertebra is the positive pole, while at the bottom of the lowest vertebra is the negative pole. Tension between the two produces life. This philosophy, thousands of years old, calls the positive pole the residence of Vishnu, spirit, while the negative pole is the seat of Kundalini, nature. These two poles might as easily be referred to as time and space, time being the beaming fire of the uppermost or positive pole, whose brilliance constantly attracts space, the negative pole. Kundalini, coiled up like a snake in the lowest vertebra, waits for the moment when she can climb up through the channel of the spine and unite with her master, Vishnu. This condition represents the highest fulfillment of consciousness, the most perfect realization of happiness and power, for the individual then experiences the supreme measure of perfection. The name Kundalini means the coiled one. Exercises of ecology yoga. The exercises designed to create this equilibrium include physical postures, chants, breathing exercises, color visualization, meditation, and concentration, all of which are designed to move Kundalini up through the various chakras to eventual union with Vishnu in the pineal gland. When the energy of Kundalini advances upward step by step, this always means a new level of consciousness on the way to finding one's true self, for the chakras are simply batteries for storing energy. Most of these centers are dormant in the average person. The gradual elevation of consciousness awakens them one at a time, in order that at the moment of fulfillment, they are not overpowered. Occasionally, someone with no understanding of the chakras suffers an accident that liberates Kundalini and causes it to race up the spinal column. His unprepared consciousness is overwhelmed, and he falls in a faint. Certain drugs may also liberate Kundalini, and an unready consciousness may be shocked into madness. But whoever reaches this highest level through conscious effort will experience it ecstatically, in perfect awareness and peace. He comes into possession of clear vision, the art of seeing the truth, for on this highest plane, his consciousness fuses and becomes one with the cosmic consciousness. The secret of every religion lies in this esoteric fact. Now I began experimenting with chanting, postures, breathing exercises, color visualization, meditation, and concentration, and it seemed to me that I quickly experienced a noticeable increase in energy. Though it would be some time before I would be able to synthesize the various exercises into a quick and efficient daily routine, already I was astonished at the progress I had made since I first decided to obtain an alpha meter and see if I could train my brainwaves. Counting the people who only count trees. The day of my Mensa examination dawned smoggy and warm, and by the time I arrived at UCLA and parked my car, I already was beginning to perspire. I found the examination room on the ground floor, a small auditorium occupied by approximately 40 people, scattered about in such a fashion as to indicate that they hoped to avoid contact. The resulting silence made the atmosphere oppressive, and when the test administrator failed to put in an appearance at the appointed time, I stepped out into the hall to stretch my legs. There I ran into a man on an identical mission. "Did you get a good look at that bunch?" he groaned. Computer programmers, mathematicians, research engineers, ivory tower specialists, the whole bunch. Give them puzzles, and they burn up the course, but when something fights back, it spooks them. That surprised me. I had thought the group somewhat withdrawn, but I had attributed this to the tension created by the forthcoming examination. Altogether, they had seemed much like any other group selected at random from the general population. Short, tall, skinny, fat, young, old, male, female, neither rich nor poor, though there was about them a bit more of the studious look than one might expect in his next-door neighbor. But that seemed natural in people who suspected that their intelligence might be high. It was difficult to account for my companion's disdain. "Professional employees," he expostulated, nearly shouting now. "I've had hundreds of them work for me. They can name all the trees and can't see the woods. Never knew one who could run his own business or take charge of anything, including himself." I thought for a moment that he expected an answer and began searching about for something to say, but he drew a deep breath and labored on. Now you look like a man who hasn't been sucking tit his whole life like the rest of those birds in there. So what in hell are you doing here? I said that I wanted to see if I could pass the test. What gives you the idea that you might be able to? He demanded. I told him that I'd recently been conditioning my brainwaves and had reason to believe that this had made me smarter. He fell back a step and looked me over carefully. You've been conditioning your what? He wanted to know. My brainwaves, I repeated firmly. Brainwaves, he exclaimed and rolled his eyes. Oh, brother. He staggered into the auditorium. Taking the intelligence test. After that, a psychologist arrived, carrying an armload of tests. I followed him into the auditorium and took a seat, and he explained that we would be required to take 2 examinations, each of which would be an hour in length, and there would be a 15-minute break between them. The tests would be against time, and they were divided into segments which tested verbal ability, mechanical ability, and reasoning ability. Since each segment had a particular amount of time allotted to it, we were not to look at the tests until he told us to begin, and we were to stop immediately when he told us to stop. With that, he passed out the first test, face down so nobody could see it, and all over the room tension was spreading as runners took their marks and the starter's gun was raised, and my explosive friend who didn't like people who could see only trees had his jaw clenched and sweat was breaking out on his forehead. Begin, cried the psychologist. We all began. When time was called on the first test, I hadn't quite finished, but I calmed down during intermission and finished the second test all right. Several weeks later, I was notified that I had passed the admission requirements and had been admitted to Mensa. I attended a number of meetings, but I never saw the man who didn't like people who could see only trees. Chapter 6. The Power to Change. The sign on the marquee announced, Oliver the Hypnotist, and seemed strangely out of place on the plush resort hotel at the edge of Mission Bay in San Diego. In the late afternoon sunshine, seagulls swooped low over the rooftops, and to the west, the waters of the bay were blue and serene. A friend named George had dragged me down here. Oliver, he said, is no ordinary stage hypnotist. Oh, he does all the stunts, but the man knows something. I'm convinced that he has deep insight into how the mind functions. But he won't open up. I got to thinking about it and decided that you're just the fellow to draw him out. Because when you hit him with that brainwave stuff of yours, he's bound to turn on. I'd resisted at first. Over the years, I'd had a lengthy skirmish with hypnotism, and I'd found the area as full of charlatans as a carnival sideshow. It was difficult to believe that a man who plied the trade of stage hypnotist could be anything other than a con man. But George, who once sold $20 million of life insurance in a single year, was mighty persuasive. He picked me up, took me to lunch, drove me to San Diego, and promised the world's finest dinner. I figured I'd be lucky if I got out of the evening without buying insurance. An unconscious decision. We parked the car, entered the hotel, and found the bar where we took seats at a table and ordered cocktails. While waiting, George offered me a cigarette. No thanks, I said. He removed one from the pack and tapped it thoughtfully. Then he lit it and peered at me through the smoke. When did you quit? He asked. Quit what? Smoking, of course. What makes you think I've quit? Listen, since I picked you up before lunch, I've offered you a cigarette a half-dozen times. You never accepted and never smoked any of your own. I remember you, buddy. You used to smoke like a furnace. What's the matter with confessing you've quit? Is that supposed to put a hex on it? I tried to remember when I'd last had a cigarette. It must have been over 24 hours. I'd lit one after breakfast the day before, which was usually the only cigarette that I truly enjoyed, but it had tasted so vile that I'd ground it out after a single puff. Later, after I'd left the house, my hand had moved unconsciously for the pack, and I discovered I'd left it at home. I thought I would buy another, but I hadn't, and when I returned home, I'd left the open pack on the desk, undisturbed. What's more, I hadn't taken it with me when I left the house this morning. Strange how it had never occurred to me that I'd quit. All these actions seemed to have been done unconsciously, so that I hadn't actually noticed, though now it was easy enough to remember. "Hey," I said. "I think I've stopped smoking." "Do tell," answered George. I could smell the aroma of his cigarette clearly. It was an aroma that had always been an automatic signal for me to light up one of my own. I smelled it deeply now, waiting for a reaction. None came. I hadn't the slightest desire to smoke. An announcement worthy of Pavlov. "I can't believe it," I said. "I think I'm cured." "Well, clue me onto it, boy. I'm sick to death of this filthy habit. I don't know what to tell you. I don't seem to have done anything. I just seem to have quit." "Oh, come now. I've seen you quit twice in the same day. There was always some method you were trying to follow." "Not this time, George. What seems to have left me of its own accord is the desire to smoke itself." He thought about this, and then he said that maybe it had something to do with my brainwave training. I told him I'd been thinking the same thing myself. Maybe the desire to smoke was the result of imbalance, and since I was beginning to achieve balance, maybe the desire had simply left me. He considered this, but thought there was more to it. We both know that smoking is primarily a conditioned reflex. A whole host of people have claimed that you can erase conditioned reflexes by brainwashing techniques, or even by retraining those reflexes. But a reflex is a reflex, and the only other way it has been known to disappear is through disuse. It was an announcement worthy of Pavlov, but the logic failed to dissuade me. "I don't have any desire to smoke," I repeated. 2 days ago I was smoking. That's certainly not long enough to erase a conditioned reflex, and I haven't been brainwashed, and I haven't been hypnotized. The word rang between us. "Are we thinking the same thing?" asked George. "Self-hypnosis," I murmured. It certainly was possible. The waitress brought the drinks, and we clicked our glasses together. "To our meeting with Oliver," George said. "People who believe they are ducks." Before long, we moved into the restaurant and ordered dinner. George proved to be right. The food was delicious. Afterwards, we lingered over coffee until the first show came on. Oliver turned out to be a handsome, athletic man of middle years who wore a dark beard and had a commanding presence. He warmed up the audience with the customary patter, then began selecting his subjects, constantly making suggestions and carefully observing whether they were followed. He was very polished. His rapid delivery and fast stream of jokes kept the audience attentive and in good humor, and he seemed to accomplish his ends without effort. Finally, he had a half-dozen subjects chosen, and these were seated on chairs arranged in a row on the stage. There were 4 women and 2 men, and as he continued bantering with them, he established that he had never seen any of them before, and none of them had ever seen him, that no one in the group had ever been hypnotized, that they were attending the show with boyfriends, husbands, wives, and girlfriends who were seated at tables in the audience, and whose reactions varied from daring them to volunteer to being apprehensive about it. Finally, he asked his subjects to close their eyes and gave them suggestions for relaxation, which he shortly changed into suggestions for sleep, and finally into suggestions that they would obey him implicitly. After this, he told them that they were attending a sad movie, and they all cried. Then he told them that they were attending a comedy, and they all laughed. Then he told them that they were all ducks, and they quacked and waddled around the stage. Then he told them that they were all dogs, and they began barking and growling. One of the males even raised his leg as if urinating on an imaginary lamppost. By this time, the audience was roaring with laughter. I glanced at George and raised an eyebrow, but he winked back, as if to say, "Just wait and see." A paper dagger. Now Oliver gave each subject a different suggestion, and the resultant slapstick had the comedy overtones of a Mack Sennett movie about the Keystone Cops. One man was told that he had an irresistible urge to kiss every woman he saw, and one woman was told that she could only be kissed on the fanny. When these two ran into each other, the house came down. Another woman was told that her raised middle finger was the peace sign, and she walked around giving everybody the finger. Still another woman was told to go around asking everybody, who, while the second of the two men was instructed to go around asking everybody, what. The last woman was told that whenever she heard the word, who, she would freeze, and whenever she heard the word, what, she would unfreeze. She was run like a robot by the hooer and water, and some of her poses were hilarious. When the laughter seemed to have reached its peak, Oliver reassembled his subjects and turned serious. Choosing the younger of the two men, he presented him with a paper dagger and told him it was real. Then he said that there was a man in the audience who intended to destroy the world, and the only way that the world could be saved was for the man to be assassinated. He instructed his subject to sneak up on this man because the man was dangerous, and to stab him to death with the dagger because it was silent and wouldn't bring the man's bodyguard. When he described the man, he described me. I glanced at George and saw that he was in on it. I didn't like it at all. Oliver told the man to start, and the audience fell into a hush, and out into the crowd the man stealthily crept with his paper dagger poised in his hand. A feeling of uneasiness gathered in my stomach. I would have liked reassurance that the dagger was paper. Down the aisles and between the tables, the man prowled, once passing close enough so I could see his eyes. They were fixed and glassy. His path now became marked by ever-shortening circles, as some unerring instinct seemed to guide him in my direction. When he finally caught sight of me, I looked him in the eye, and he hid behind a table. Then, despite the fact that I continued to stare at him, he slithered forward, glaring. The power of suggestion. Frankly, I was unnerved. Even though I could now see that the dagger was only paper, I had no doubt that the man would throw himself upon me, and I didn't know whether to defend myself or run. It certainly seemed foolhardy to stand there and do nothing. I silently appealed to George for help, but he only smiled. I was growing irritated and angry. Suddenly, with a blood-curdling yell, the man leapt to his feet and charged, paper dagger aloft, and eyes lighted with fury. I braced myself for the impact. Then Oliver's voice cracked through the room. "Freeze!" he cried. The man froze on the spot. After that, Oliver came over and talked to him soothingly, and led him away and awakened all the subjects from their trances, and made a little speech about the power of suggestion, how it could cause murders and riots and robberies and arsons just as easily as it could cause brotherhood and love and justice and abundance. Then he left the stage to applause. But I wasn't paying much attention. My old friend Adrenaline had come to my aid, and I hadn't used him. And now he was complaining. I felt sick to my stomach. I let off steam by telling George how little I appreciated being involved in this stunt, but his composure remained unshaken as he assured me that there was a point, and I would know what it was soon. With that, he took me by the elbow and steered me through the crowd. Here and there people shied away in apprehension, so I pasted on a smile in hopes they would perceive that I wasn't intending to destroy the world after all. Oliver was waiting for us in his dressing room. He had changed into a loose white shirt and dark slacks, and looked the picture of magnetic health. When George introduced us, he shook hands searchingly. "If that had been a real dagger, you could have been killed," he said. "Even as it was, you could have been hurt." I told him I was aware of that fact. "Are you satisfied that the whole thing was authentic?" he asked. I answered that I thought it was authentic. "Good," he said. "Sit down and tell me about brainwaves. We may be able to help each other." The horse and the rider. I sat down and considered where to begin. We obviously didn't have all night, since he had another show in 2 hours, so I tried to cut through extraneous matter and get right to the point. "I think I've stumbled onto the brainwave key to the subconscious," I said. When people learn how to use it, they can put themselves into highly suggestible states. They may even believe that what they imagine is real. He leaned forward in his chair. "Carry on," he said. I told him how delta and theta brain rhythms were aligned with the subconscious mind and alpha and beta rhythms with the conscious mind, and I told him how alpha showed the passive portion of the conscious mind and beta the active, while delta indicated the passive.
Imagine never paying for groceries again. From now to March 31st, every time you shop and save using the Grocery Outlet app, you get a chance to win free groceries for life. You can see all the incredible deals we have in stock, like fresh produce, premium meats, and all your favorite brands. Don't wait. Shop with the app today at your neighborhood grocery outlet for your chance to be one of the 2 winners who will receive $500 monthly for 40 years. No purchase necessary. Restrictions apply. Many will enter. Few will win. See GroceryOutlet.com for details.
Grocery Outlet Bargain Market.
Portion of the subconscious mind and theta the active. Then I pointed out how the subconscious mind itself was passive, while the conscious mind was active, and I remarked that everything indicated the existence of some delicate balancing mechanism between the passive and active portions of man's mind. Oliver kept nodding all through this, and when I finished, he said, "Man has 2 minds, that's clear enough. He's dual-natured, dual-minded, and oriented to a world of duality. The subconscious mind is the horse, and the conscious mind is the rider, and the horse does what the rider tells it to, and any rider can take over the horse. But without a rider, the horse acts crazy. You saw me take over several horses tonight, so you know that riders are replaceable. And if you've ever visited a mental hospital, you've seen plenty of horses without riders." I liked the metaphor and told him so. Then I described the dynamics of ecology, and how it was my idea that a perfectly balanced interchange between conscious and subconscious minds produced the mental power described as genius. He reflected on that, and then he said he thought it was true, because in his experience, the subconscious mind had all of the powers of imagination, but little, if any, of the powers of reason. On the other hand, the conscious mind seemed to have all of the powers of reason, but little, if any, of the powers of imagination. Genius, he had to admit, seemed the result of a classical marriage between reason and imagination. We were hitting it off fine. George sat there and beamed. An experience with hypnosis. Now Oliver apologized for sending the man with the paper dagger after me, but he explained that he wanted to illustrate dramatically the dangers of hypnotism. "You wouldn't give an atom bomb to a child or a maniac," he said, "and neither would I. But from what you tell me, many people soon will be gaining access to their subconscious minds through brainwave feedback training. If that is so, it is important that they know the dangers involved. It's a pity that this knowledge can't be kept out of the hands of the selfish and greedy. That would lessen the danger considerably." I said that I planned to publish a book, but I hoped to veil the most powerful facts in such a manner that the selfish would be unable to use them. Oliver brightened. I further explained that hypnotism would be an important part of the book, and while I had had some experience with it both as subject and practitioner, my experience as a subject had been unrewarding because I couldn't be hypnotized. Oliver then offered to hypnotize me, and I gave him permission. Within a few minutes, he placed me in a light trance and produced anesthesia in my left arm. Pins could be stuck in it, and I could feel nothing. I observed this effect with misgivings, but when he gave me the suggestion that all feeling had returned, I winced at the touch of a pin. "You're not a difficult subject now," he said. "Perhaps your brainwave training had something to do with it." George interrupted then, and told Oliver how I had suddenly quit smoking without even trying, where before I had quit dozens of times only to begin again. The King and the Brilliant Idiot. Oliver studied me. "What's the name of that passive brain rhythm?" "Alpha." "Did you have trouble producing it?" "So much trouble that I thought I'd never learn." "Then the theory you hold seems to be right. The subconscious won't accept a suggestion unless the conscious mind is passive. Your conscious mind had difficulty being passive, so your desire to quit smoking had no effect. As soon as you trained your conscious mind to be passive, the desire to quit smoking, which you continued to have, impressed the subconscious and was turned into fact. I was pleased with how perfectly this explanation dovetailed with both theory and events. Oliver leaned forward searchingly. I can see that you are onto something profound and true, and I thank you for sharing it with me. First thing in the morning, I intend to launch a study of brainwaves. Now let me share with you what I know of hypnosis. It is only two things. First, the subconscious mind is a brilliant idiot. It will try its best to do or be whatever it is told to do or be, and it has vast and powerful resources. Second, the conscious mind is a child, become king. It cries when things go against it, because it does not yet know its power. Let the brilliant idiot find a wise king, and the genius of man is established. The words set up echoes in my mind, and I tried to think where I'd heard them. Oliver smiled and opened a drawer of his dressing table. He withdrew a battered book and tossed it to me. Those sentiments were written 15 years ago. Strange how the wheel comes full circle. The book in my lap was my own 3 magic words. Good enough to bottle. George got into the act then and confessed how he and Oliver had hatched up this plot after Oliver had learned that he knew me. George had thought I needed a shock treatment because I'd lost sight of the principles in my own books, thus the man with the paper dagger. I had to admit that the shock had been successful, but I maintained that I'd never lost sight of the principles in my books, because I'd never truly had them in view. It was one thing, I explained, to reason things out, and quite another to experience them. Now I felt I was experiencing them. Somebody rapped on the door and called 10 minutes, and Oliver began dressing. He asked if we were staying for the second show, but we had a 2.5-hour drive back to Los Angeles, so we begged off. We shook hands and told him goodbye, promising to keep him posted. When George sought out the waiter and asked for the dinner check, he found that Oliver had paid it. For most of the drive back to Los Angeles, we were silent, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Halfway back, George announced, "Now that you've become suggestible, I think you should buy an insurance policy." "Sorry," I replied. "I've got my beta rhythm on." When he dropped me off, I stood under the streetlight, thanking him. "You know," he said, "I think you've lost weight too. Whatever you've got, you should bottle it." As I entered the apartment, I checked my belt. It was taken in a notch, and my pants felt looser. I didn't own a scale, but I promised to weigh myself at the first opportunity. That opportunity came 2 days later. I'd taken off 15 pounds. A review of hypnosis. The meeting with Oliver had left strange repercussions in my mind, and I now found myself drawn to the pages of 3 magic words and to try to discern, if possible, what had prompted a man of obviously superior intellect and knowledge to keep this book throughout the years, and to find in it help and guidance. I was pleased to discover how well the book accorded with my present positions, even after the lapse of 15 years, and I could see that what had once been primarily an intellectual perception had now filtered down into my subconscious, and I become an experience as well. In truth, it delighted me that I had written this book so long ago, for I could not remember having either the resources or the skill. It seemed to me that my pen had been guided by a hand other than my own. The conclusions drawn concerning the conscious and subconscious minds and the use of hypnotism seemed worth repeating. 1. The conscious mind is an instrument for the recording of pain and pleasure. It measures these experiences, files them for recall, analyzes the circumstances that produce them, and plans escape from pain and flight into pleasure. 2. The conscious mind is a finely tuned instrument with the sole aim of physical survival of the organism. 3. The conscious mind is as destructible as the body of which it is a part. 4. The conscious mind has no memory of its own, but has the ability to call up memories from the subconscious. 5. The memory of the subconscious mind is perfect. 6. The subconscious mind is the infinite substance of which all things are made. It has no beginning and no end, and everything exists within it. 7. The subconscious mind is everything and knows everything. It is everywhere at all times, and all of it is anywhere at any time, for space and time cannot exist in the infinite. 8. Inductive reasoning attempts to arrive at law through circumstance, and is the type of reasoning primarily done by the conscious mind, which can also reason deductively. 9. Deductive reasoning attempts to arrive at circumstances through law, and is the only type of reasoning done by the subconscious mind. 10. Hypnotism exposes the essence of the subconscious mind and allows us to see that it responds only to suggestion. 11. We cannot order our lives through hypnotism, but only through consciously exercising control of the subconscious mind, which means consciously exercising control over our thoughts. 12. Meditation is the tool with which we seek to control our thoughts, and thus to control our world through the subconscious mind. 13. Thought transference is proof that all life exists within one intelligence, universal subconscious mind. 14. Intuition is proof that universal subconscious mind contains all knowledge and will reveal it to the conscious mind of man when the proper rapport is established. 15. Subconscious mind has the power to heal the body and to create physical form and physical circumstance. But acute ill health.
Need inspiration? Shop Ralph's for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouth-watering meals with savings beyond low prices. Like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Ralph's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
We've locked in low prices to help you save big store-wide. Look for the locked in low prices tags and enjoy extra savings throughout the store. Ralph's, fresh for everyone.
Still must be dealt with by the doctor, and acute mental distress still must be dealt with by the psychiatrist, for we have not come far enough in faith and conception to be able to always treat cause and not symptoms. 16. First cause of every object and circumstance is its creation on the plane of mind. Path of saint or path of madman. Then there were the three magic words themselves. You are God. Path of saint or path of madman, depending on balance or imbalance. A few nights later, a man called me from across the country. He was drunk. So you're the Andersen who wrote three magic words, he cried. Boy, what a salesman you're. I just finished reading Success, Cybernetics. I couldn't believe the same man wrote both books. You must be the world's greatest conman. I tried to tell him that each book was an opposite side of the same coin, and the truth lay in putting them together, but he was well into monomania by this time and didn't want to think. I finally told him that my royalty on each book was 5 cents, and if he'd give me his address, I'd send him his dime back. Surprisingly, he gave me his address. Unflinchingly, sent him his dime. Not long afterwards, I had a call from George who said that Oliver would be in Los Angeles in a few days and wondered if we could all get together. The prospect excited me because I wanted to run brainwave tests on someone who was under hypnosis. So I asked George if he'd ever been hypnotized, and he said he hadn't. And I told him what I had in mind and asked if he was willing to be the subject. And he said he'd do it, just for me, and wondered if I'd like to buy some insurance. I said I'd think about it. It doesn't often rain in Los Angeles, but when it does, it's usually a downpour. On the day that Oliver arrived, I was considering building in Arkansas. The streets were rivers, the freeways jammed with stalled traffic, and here and there, hills were sliding into the sea. By the time the three of us had gathered, we were all thankful for a haven. First off, I ran a brainwave test on Oliver. He could produce alpha all right, but he wasn't very good at it, and I let him know that he had something to learn. That's when he told me that he'd never been hypnotized, that he'd gone to the best professionals in the business, and nobody could put him under. Since this had been my own problem, I felt immediate camaraderie and suggested that it wasn't so bad learning to be passive because you didn't have to be unless you wanted to be, and it could often be useful. He said that he'd been reading enough about brainwaves to realize he could help himself by undergoing brainwave training. So I gave him the address of the electronic wizard and he resolved to pick up an alpha meter. Brainwaves and hypnosis. After that, we both worked on George. I hooked him up to the alpha meter and ran a test, and he produced strong beta with eyes open and relatively sparse alpha with eyes closed. So if the theory held true, he wouldn't be a particularly good hypnotic subject. He wasn't. First, Oliver used a simple eye closure technique, suggesting to George that his eyelids were growing heavier and he wouldn't be able to keep them open. Everything seemed to be going fine, but when George got his eyes closed, the alpha meter didn't pick up any change in brain rhythms. And right in the middle of everything, Oliver broke off. "You're trying too hard to cooperate," he told George. "Resist a little." He began again by dangling a ring before George's eyes and asking him to concentrate on the to and fro movement, at the same time suggesting again that his eyes were growing tired and that it was difficult to keep them open. As soon as George's eyes closed, Oliver put the ring away and began suggesting that George's right hand was growing lighter and beginning to float. He kept up these suggestions patiently, and pretty soon George's hand rose from the table. I checked the brainwave patterns. George was producing alpha, though not profusely. Now Oliver began suggesting that George's hand was rising higher and pretty soon would come to rest on top of his head, and when it did, George would fall into deep trance. He would be able to hear only what Oliver said, and he would obey it. Higher and higher George's hand floated until at last it came to rest on top of his head, and when it did, there was an abrupt change in his brain rhythms. He immediately began producing a powerful alpha in the 810 cycle per second range, large amplitude, and these rhythms were nearly continuous. I pointed this out to Oliver, and he nodded thoughtfully. Now George was informed that he was an excellent tennis player who was engaged in a hard match with a skillful opponent and would have to call upon all his resources to win. He began making small, simulated tennis movements in his chair, sometimes grunting aloud. So I expected the alpha meter to be producing beta, but it began producing theta instead. Another job for the electronic wizard. After this, Oliver told George that he was lying beside his favorite trout stream on a beautiful day and had just caught his limit, and the soft spring breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and pine needles, and he was going to take a nap and fall fast asleep. I expected the alpha meter to begin producing delta rhythms, but again we heard theta. Intrigued now, Oliver led George through a half-dozen other imaginary situations. Never once did we hear a beta or delta rhythm. There would be a powerful alpha while George was just sitting there without imagining anything, and the moment he became involved in an imaginary situation, the meter gave out with theta rhythms. For the better part of an hour, Oliver continued in this fashion, and there was never a deviation from the pattern. At last he brought George back out of his deep hypnosis by suggesting to him that he count backward from 10, and when he reached 1, he would emerge into full consciousness and feel fresh and energetic, and remember everything he'd experienced. When he woke up, he was astonished. For a moment he had trouble orienting himself. As far as he was concerned, he had just finished playing tennis, going fishing, attending a stage play, giving a lecture, and selling $1 million insurance policy. Gradually, it came back to him. And when it did, he wasn't so sure that he liked it. Never before had he surrendered his volition to anyone else, and the thought that he had been unable to tell dream from reality distressed him. But when I told him of the strong alpha and theta rhythms he had produced in his hypnotic state, and how, in my opinion, he could learn to take these imaginary excursions any time he chose, without any danger and with highly creative results, simply by learning to control his brainwaves, he too asked for the address of the electronic wizard and vowed to obtain an alpha meter. Altogether, it had been an interesting afternoon. When the three of us said goodbye, we all felt we had learned something. Alpha unquestionably was aligned with the passivity of the conscious mind and was a highly suggestible state. We had further shown that when imaginary images became so vivid that they seemed to be real, the brain was producing theta. And we had discovered that hypnosis lowered brainwave frequencies into the alpha-theta region. It now became clear why I had finally quit smoking. While producing alpha, I had placed my conscious mind in a passive state so the subconscious could be reached by suggestion. My desire to quit smoking then had impressed itself on the subconscious, which had turned the desire into fact. Brainwave training had enabled me to use self-hypnosis. It was easy to see, however, that this technique was a double-edged sword. Some people were already too passive. Their subconscious minds would take suggestion all right. The trouble was that they would take suggestion from everybody and everything. If such a person managed to resolve to quit smoking, the first whiff of somebody's cigarette gave him a new suggestion, and he was back to smoking again. Such a person needed willpower training, not alpha training. Willpower was concentration. My own willpower had been fine, but the moment I relaxed it, I began smoking again, because my will hadn't impressed my subconscious. The gateway to the subconscious was through the alpha rhythm, and I hadn't been able to turn on alpha. As soon as I learned how, my subconscious was reached, and I quit smoking without even trying. The brilliant idiot had received his orders. Something of the same nature seemed to be happening concerning my weight. Already I had dropped 15 pounds without going on a diet or making specific efforts. I thought back over the past few weeks and tried to remember if there'd been any change in my eating habits. There had been a change, all right. The wise man takes the middle path. I'd always been a meat and potatoes man, and now I couldn't remember the last time I'd had meat. I'd been eating raw fruits and vegetables, unsalted nuts, whole grain cereals, dairy products and shellfish, and taking very little alcohol. These were drastic changes, and it was difficult to believe that I had made them all.
Cox powers the Big Easy on the biggest game days of the year. And this year, we are going even bigger. We've supercharged the Caesars Superdome, upgrading capacity from 10 to 40 gigs, and laid over 1,300 miles of fiber optic cable across the city, connecting thousands of fans watching in New Orleans and even more across the country. As the nation's fastest internet provider, Cox is always stepping up our game.
Without being aware of it. Not that I'd ever had anything against such a diet. It was just that it was generally second choice to my meat and potatoes diet, which also had been liberally sprinkled with ice cream, soft drinks, pies and cakes, lots of processed foods, and plenty of liquor. All these things I seemed to have eliminated. I couldn't help wondering what powerful change had taken place in my apostat to so drastically alter my preference in foods, but I had little doubt that it had something to do with balance. As the days went by and my pants grew looser, I was driven to the drugstore to measure my avoirdupois on fortune-telling scales. I dropped my penny in the slot, and a little card came out with my weight printed on it. 212 pounds. The opposite side of the card was interesting also. The wise man takes the middle path, it said. Chapter 7. Inner Ecology. Over the next few months, my weight continued to drop at the rate of 2 pounds per week. When it reached 187, it stabilized. Altogether, 50 pounds had melted away. As I watched them disappear, I became aware of two causes. Fundamental, of course, was my ability to produce alpha, but there was the balancing mechanism of ecology as well. For example, the legacy left us by Einstein is that matter becomes energy, and energy becomes matter. In ecological terms, this might be stated: space becomes time, and time becomes space. When a person took in more energy than he expended, that surplus energy turned into matter, and he became fat. On the other hand, when a person expended more energy than he took in, some of his substance turned into energy, and he became thin. At just the right weight, he was perfectly balanced. Since the regimen I was following had restored balance to my body, I chose to call it inner ecology. That regimen consisted of the following procedures. 1. Meditation. 2. Concentration. 3. Physical postures. 4. Breath control. 5. Chanting. 6. Color imagery. 7. Diet. The art of meditation. Meditation